your question will be the last question, so you'll have plenty of time before you have to get into that. None of these questions, just because you read it, doesn't mean you have to be the first one to answer it. They are just you're sort of opening up the question to the group, and we'll go from there.
We are all good now, by the way. So.
Okay. So let's do the first thing, which is take our deep breath together. I'll just say 3, 2, 1, and then let's all take a deep breath, and then we'll let it out. So 3, 2, 1. Okay. Welcome to the Unscripted room. The theme today is thinking in language. And I think our job is to try to explore the relationship between what we think and how we express that through language, and what does that mean for the outcomes of our lives. How can we see the correlation between those things? From the conversation that we already had in the community space to coming in here, I think we've assembled an amazing panel to be able to have this discussion and to be able to sort of open ourselves up to the perspectives in the room and see what we can learn. So with that said, what we'll do is jump right into our first question. So Alex, if you want to read that one to everybody, then we can go from there. Oh, you don't have to be fragile about it. You can.
It's a nice seal, though. I don't want to break it.
All
right, what I'm seeing is, what role has language and thinking played in shaping your life?
Well, I don't know if there's really a difference between those two things. I mean, I think thinking is language and language is thinking. I mean, at least for me, I think in my words, in my voice. So it's led me everywhere. I also think it's like the most powerful tool we have as humans. Language it is our primary form of abstraction, right? So it helps us build deeper understanding by abstracting complex ideas, right? So we can think more. So for me, language has been the primary driver of every belief and thought that I've ever had.
One of the reasons why we chose to do thinking and language together, and to just a shout out to Oliver, this is the way that we picked all the themes for the season, is that Oliver and Trevor are our sort of community leads. And what we did, and actually my son Dashel, who participated in this as well, they came up with themes that they thought would be really great based on the core principles that we have. So this was Oliver's, and I think where Oliver, I'll let you jump in, Oliver, if you want to, but the concept was that there are so many different languages that people use, and sometimes the way that the phrasing happens in different languages ends up meaning something completely different, and the way that we even build our own self-image. And then there's the other framework, which is like the language that you talk to yourself in. And that's not only just the language, but it's like, what tone do you talk to yourself in? Are you kind to yourself? Are you cruel to yourself? All of those things end up playing into both thinking in language in these really unique and interesting ways. And we just thought, this is kind of a cool thing to explore our own self-awareness around. So
I also think it's a really cool conversation, because any intellectual conversation about anything ultimately leads to you questioning the language that you're using. And so it's kind of like a portal as a topic into anything, I think, as well as being interesting because language is both internal, external, and very powerful. Just like you were saying, Penta, it's that it is perhaps the defining human tool.
I think it is, right? I think that's almost like...
I mean, I am no expert in that particular area, but I do believe some other creatures do have some forms of communication.
Right.
I don't know if you can consider it what we have. The tools we have are, I think, fairly unique.
We talked about that a lot, too, when we were thinking of which themes to choose, because I don't know if you all know this, but Oliver is obsessed with whale communication and the languages that whales have, which we found as a group to be so interesting and dynamic conversation. But it does open you up to so much about like, okay, if there are other forms of language outside of what we understand as Homo sapiens to be the languages that we use, what does that mean? Are we alone? Are we not alone? I mean, it's like fascinating stuff to start to get into when you do.
I think it's also extraordinary both to see when you have, an interest in the way that animals communicate. It's extraordinary to see the ways that they communicate and the things that they're able to communicate, but then also to pause and think, I think it's so extraordinary the way that a whale is able to tell a story to another whale, and when they speak or sing, it can travel for a couple miles, which is extraordinary. But I also know that I couldn't I could never sit down with a whale, but I couldn't settle myself in the water with a whale and explain the concept of the arc of a ball, right? And there's so many things that we are able to explain because we have the language that we have to kids, even to not fully formed humans. And it is kind of extraordinary to think about that, the way that we have pulled away from other animals and being able to convey information with just sound.
There's also one other form of language that I think would be really fun for us all to explore tonight, which is body language. Stuff that's unspoken. Because I think that there's a lot there. And actually, I would say, the skill that I felt like I developed the most in my career was being able to read a room. And I don't know exactly what percentage. I think I would be making it up anyways, but it's a pretty high percentage of what I think I'm doing when I read the room is to look at body language and to try to figure out, what does that say? There's so much that happens in the eyes that gets communicated without ever having to say anything. So there's, language and thinking, you're right. They are one and the same. And yet we all have to go through a certain process of being thoughtful about what we allow to become the language that comes out of our mouth, even if we can give ourselves permission to be free in the way that we allow that to happen in our minds. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on.
I'm curious about the whale. I don't know much about whale communication, but I wonder if the challenge in communicating with a whale is really, like I had mentioned, abstraction. Is like the layers of abstraction needed to really explain something to a whale, whereas like a kid, even an infant, is experiencing a common world with you, and a lot of abstractions that we use are like built into our everyday language, like bottle, not plastic spherical container that has liquid in it, right? Like we abstract into these simple ideas, and so we can create complexity, we can create simplicity through complexity, right? And that allows us to package a lot more in our communication. I don't know if whales are able to create that layered levels of communication that we create. And if you tie in things like body language, you're talking about even deeper, more layers, more complexity being expelled from our bodies and our voice.
I can talk about the whale thing.
Yeah, go for it.
So essentially the current state of the science that is invested in discovering whale language has discovered up to this point that they do appear to have language that has emergent complexity, and they communicate with things called codas, which are like sequences of clicks. So a certain coda might be like 3-2-1 or 1-4-6, and it appears that the language has it appears that the codas themselves are comparable to like letters or syllables, and that the way that they combine does have a level of emergent complexity. And another part of that that's interesting is that even whales belonging to the same species appear to develop different regional dialects. And they also appear to do things that can't be explained through instinct that are also regional, like different regional hunting patterns or even fashion, which is pretty cool. And currently, there is teams of people around the world that are collecting data on whales, like their movements, their proximity to each other, and collecting the audio and trying to use, advanced data processing systems to try and develop an understanding of the language, which, is a pretty ambitious task. And it's interesting to think about the things that a kind of a whale might talk about as well, right? Whether it's just basic information or whether the whales have their own, schools of philosophy that out in the deeps of the world, they're conversing to each other in this hidden language.
So, Lisa, I was thinking as he was talking, is that anything that you know anything about that connects? I mean, you were telling us your history with numerology. Numbers would be a language, yeah.
Numbers are definitely a language. With the whales, it's the frequency of the sound that is resonating, at least from what I understand. The pitch of their sound is such a positive vibration that it is so healing for everything that encounters that. It brings it into a very positive energy. And I do believe whales, I think everything they do communicate. Every animal must communicate, but especially like the whales, like they know how to like bubble feed. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever been to Alaska
No.
or anywhere? Have you ever heard of bubble feeding? It's a technique that they do in order to be able to get all the fish to come up at once so that they can eat them.
Yeah.
They go in a circle together and then they come up really fast and everything flies out of the water and they're able to eat it all. It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as far as language, like I do personally believe that our first language is our feeling side. It is, like you said about reading a room, like I believe like our heart is our feeling side, and when someone first starts to speak, it's first goes through our feelings to see what we're thinking about the energy of what the person is giving off. And it's kind of fascinating. Like words are very important and the words have meaning. And as far as our thinking with the language, I think we first are assessing the energy of the people we're communicating with to see if they are genuine, what it's all about on that end. It is all about how we perceive things first. And then it goes to the intellect mind to process. And I think we're not taught how to get out of our minds thoughts and thinking to drop into our feeling side to see how it's resonating with our own individual self to see if it is our truth for us.
It's a fascinating topic, right? Because so explores a couple things. One is, I'm curious where your gut, where does your intuition come from? Is it coming from your feelings? Is it coming from your thoughts? Is it something that you have to reconcile your thoughts and your feelings to be able to start to trust your intuition? But that makes a lot of sense. It also, I think, goes to what you were saying in that, if you got very technical about what a bottle is, then the technicality of that can be very complex. Like the technicality of mathematics can be very complex. But if somebody says bottle in a way that doesn't make you feel threatened by this bottle, it will also completely change the way you think about a bottle forever. And the younger you are, the more likely that gets imprinted on you. So feelings have to be deeply incorporated into the way that language is used because the tone of that language is so massively important to the feeling.
I think it's also important how we identify feelings, right? I think as I have grown older and I've learned the nuance in different sorts of feelings, what might have just been anger when I was 14 and said, that's anger, that's anger, that's anger, that's anger. Or like, no, that's frustration, that's anger, that's actually annoyance, like you just try to, as you develop a stronger sense of language of your feelings, it is its own palette of things to assess, right? And we have abstractions for all these stirs of emotions that we have, and we label them, and the more I'm not one that favors labels, but I think a lot of times when you want to talk about something, you want to think about something, when you can categorize it in some way, you can put some kind of label on it. I don't want to lock in labels, but put on a label, that's an abstraction, and then we can think more easily because we've reduced the complexity of what it means because I can tell you what my anxiety feels like by like the symptoms and everything that I get from anxiety, but it's a lot easier for me to label it as anxiety and then be able to think about it and communicate it. And so I think feelings are unbelievably important, and certainly they come prior to our ability to use words. But I think words actually benefit our feelings if we're reflective about it, because they allow us to expand our palette of feelings, right? Not just happy, sad. If you're like a baby, right? It's like uncomfortable, hungry, right? Like and so as you expand your experience and you expand your language, you can actually expand that palette of feelings as well, which I think is important to do. But I think it's not restricted to feelings versus language. Not that that's what you were implying, but that I think the two of them really help benefit each other. And as you were mentioning, as the way we say things, I think dramatically can change how we feel with them. I was just talking to someone whose native language is in Italian, and I used the word empathy, and they were like, "Oh, sympathy," and I was like, "No," and they were like, "Compassion," and I was like, "No," because those have directly related. Those are like directly in Italian. They have like direct translations, but they don't have a translation as far as our communication was able to discern.
So they have no translation for empathy.
For empathy, so like now
that's a rough one to
But
not
for
have a
them,
translation for.
it sounded like it's just combined little bits into the other. But you were trying to distinguish, like, well, what? So the conversation became, well, what is different about it, right? Why is sympathy different from empathy, different from compassion? And it struck me like it can't be that they are deficient in thinking these ideas, but they must be thinking about them in a different way or in a more complex way because they don't have this very simple word that I have.
Yes.
And this has come up a few times talking to them about, just translating things back and forth between English and Italian of saying, we don't really have a way to say that. It's not really quite the same. And I don't know if it limits your thinking, but certainly I think learning more than one language, which I heard you were multilingual, is...
I'll take it. I speak almost enough Spanish to call myself fluent.
Cool. Yeah. So I think that certainly expands your ability to think more because you have a larger palette again of words to choose from.
I do think that, I have done some reading, and I'm not going to be able to pull up citations right now, but about the idea that we learn to express our thoughts and feelings with language, and then because language is like the jacket that we're using for our thoughts and feelings, the model, it changes how we feel. So I've heard people talk before about how, certain languages might have a different way of describing present tense versus future tense, and that can change like a cultural understanding of the difference between I am doing this now and I am going to do this, as one example I've heard. In Spanish, there are two ways to say I love you. There's like two direct translations. They both, if you were reading a book that had been translated from Spanish into English, te amo and te quiero would both be translated as I love you, but they do have often slight different nuances in the way that they're used in the language. And it does, I think, it limits the way that you're able to express certain things, and it expands the way that you express certain things. And different languages literally allow us to think or prevent us from thinking certain things, which is kind of wild to imagine, right? Like your language isn't going to change the way that you feel, but it's going to change the way that you validate what you feel and the way that you communicate what you feel, and it's going to change what you think is real and what isn't, which is, that's like what 1984 is about, is this like very intentional pruning of language so that people aren't able to express or think things. And that's one, terrifying side way of thinking about it. But it's also really exciting when you're interested in languages to be looking at examples of like there's languages that have lots of different ways of referring to different groups of people. There's languages that are incredibly gendered and languages that are not gendered at all. And so to be sort of looking at translations and breaking down what different things mean. In Arabic, I've taken some Arabic. In Arabic, you cannot say many things without gendering yourself. Like, I am Alex, I'm from Boston, is a gendered sentence in Arabic. I would have to identify myself using masculine words. So the idea that, like gender might be much more baked into a personal identity of someone who was raised learning the word I as a gendered word versus we learn the word I as much more just like, it means there's an entity that is the one that's here, and we're not assigning any value to it. It does change the way I think that people and that cultures conceptualize really important ideas.
I know from talking to other educators, that in the foreign languages, in Spanish and Italian, there's been some like kind of modernization of like how do we deal with transgendered people in these gendered languages, and it's like a challenge that someone has to kind of sort through, right? Because language does influence how we think to that degree. You know, doesn't mean you can't think of those things, but how do you express them?
Sometimes, though, I think that when these conversations come up, they get caught in like a intellectual surface, and that we forget that the goal is to get down into the depth of it, right? Which what it feels like when you get into language is the depth is the way that as you use language, it begins to form the way you identify with yourself. I've shared this before on the podcast, but I had this experience one night where I was hanging out with like a second tier friend. Not that I didn't enjoy this person, but somebody who was like a friend of a friend who I knew, but I didn't have any intimate experience with this person, but he was Irish, grew up in Dublin. And we sat down one night, and it ended up being that the room sort of left us alone, and we just had the two of us to be able to have this conversation. He knew what I did for work. He had some entrepreneurial stuff that he was doing. But he told me the story of when he was a child living in Dublin, that he grew up with very little resources, and like him and 11 siblings. And they used to go out onto the streets, and they had somebody who would give them flowers in the morning, and then they would let these kids go out and sell flowers to people who were walking through Dublin, and then come back and split the money up however it was. And he was telling me that him and his siblings learned very quickly that language was the key to understanding how to sell flowers. That especially they loved selling flowers to Americans, because what they picked up very, very quickly is that Americans would always say, I am hungry, I am this, I am that. And that they picked up on as children that if you say I am, that you are already allowing your language to betray the fact that you feel identified with the feeling or behavior on the other side. Whereas other languages would say I feel, and
In
that
Spanish,
one word.
it's, I have hunger, is what you would say.
Yeah, so it changes the way that
interesting.
the language that you're using actually re-identifies what you're identifying with. Am I saying that I'm observing something that's happening to me right now, or I'm saying that I 100% identify with whatever this feeling is? It changed my life to have that conversation with him. You know, those conversations where it was like that thought had never entered my mind. And then he opened up that thought, and I was like, oh shit, the number of things that I'm saying on a regular basis that are probably something that I'm over-identifying with for no reason. It doesn't benefit the outcomes that I'm trying to get to, but I've just allowed myself to be lazy with my language so that my language was a reflection of what other people taught me rather than a reflection of me being able to share exactly who I am.
Well, and I as a self in our society, in American society, is very high value, right? Whereas like I as part of a community, part of all women, part of all men, right, is not as valued here. And so in our language, when we say I, and it's this non-gendered singular thing, has a different meaning to us, I think, than when you're talking about I a man, right? Where you are implying you are part of a collective.
Yeah.
I am is very much, I think, me, as not part of a group.
Yeah. Right, which is so interesting because I think in some ways there's so many benefits from being able to feel like you are a part of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
And then in other times, it's so important that you don't get into groupthink with your language to the point where you've lost your ability to be a free thinker, which might be one of the most privileged things that we all have the ability to do, which is that no one can monitor what we're actually thinking. Mm-hmm. That is a very unique experience that we get to have. And really, we only get judged by the thoughts that we choose to express through the language that we use.
And maybe that is the difference between where I said language and thinking were somewhat non-inextricable. I think that maybe that's the part where they separate, right? Is I can have as much thoughts in my head, but the language is only is one way that I can communicate those thoughts outwardly, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like the thinking is entirely my own, even if I'm using language.
Yeah.
It's that a choice to express it either through the language of speaking or of math we talked about, or like art, or whatever that language is, whatever that form of expression. I mean, we didn't really define where language boundaries lie, but to me, I feel like if you're expressing stuff within some kind of structure, you're probably doing some kind of language.
That seems like a fair way to define it.
I was just going to say, I think that there's another interesting concept which has already come up somewhat already, but that people have done some work to try to, to try to label the different capacities in which people think, which has got to be some real tricky work. Certainly not something that you're ever going to feel certain about, because it exists in the mind, which is sort of, at least to this point, fairly intangible. But generally, I think people think, in imagery, sometimes two-dimensional, sometimes three-dimensional. People think in sounds, and it's really interesting how language can be both of those things. Like as I'm sure some of you, maybe not you, Lisa, know, I'm very inclined towards sound. Like I play music and I like to think, and in my mind, my language comes through as a stream of sounds. But to people who are deaf, it actually doesn't. They actually see it physically. At least, that's what they have communicated. I'm sure it would be kind of difficult for them to communicate much about sound at all. So it's kind of a difficult one to unpack. But there's also the thinking in terms of emotional sensations or in smells. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic in the room between, like, I know Brett is primarily an emotional thinker, and that's maybe the number one thing that he's aware of. Whereas I would imagine Penta, I know, is my computer science teacher, and is very, I would describe his intelligence as being very data-based, right? Mathematical, logical.
I do favor those things, but I don't think I'm like single-faceted. But sure, I like.
Well, I just
I
mean
like those
the
things.
primary
Yeah,
thing
gotcha.
that comes to mind in my experience of you as
well, also in a very particular role.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting examining, how language could be an auditory, an audio
It's a
experience, but
sensory.
also a written one,
Yeah.
or something else.
Yeah. What I was going to say about, and I'm no expert on this, about deaf people, but they can't hear, but they can feel. Like when we're at a concert and you feel the bass, you're feeling it through you. And I think that their sense of that is more heightened than the people who can hear. I think if you're blind or if you can't hear, I think your other senses rise up to be able to interpret things.
I heard a story one time about a young man who was blind, but his mom refused to allow him to see himself as a victim of not having eyesight. So she started to look into what she could do for him, and what they found was that humans have the ability to use echolocation to a very small degree. So if he learned how to click, he could somehow figure out how the clicking sound that he was making could bounce off of solid shapes, and he could get a basic idea of like riding his bike to avoid a car that's parked here, because he could sort of get a sense that there was something big that he needed to avoid in any of those areas. And this young man grew up to be an adult who ended up honing the sense of this echolocation to the point where he became very proficient at being able to use the clicking sound to be able to navigate spaces, even though he was completely blind. I think that we're way more amazing than we give ourselves credit for. I think that's kind of the bottom line, right? Is that what we're capable of doing might require extraordinary discomfort, but through extraordinary discomfort, you can find something out about yourself that you just had no idea could even exist. You lose one thing, you gain another. That seems pretty true that seems like a reasonable allegory for all of life. You know what I mean? That seems how it works, but.
That's also just a really striking example of, if nobody had that idea and nobody had tested that idea really, really thoroughly, because you'd have to work really, really hard at echolocation before you could actually use it, then this person would have had a whole different life.
The key is actually, I remember a video of it when he was a teenager that I watched. I used to work in this assistive technology area, and we used to use a video including him. And he had learned it since he was a baby, like since he was a kid. Like so, it's his whole life. And so it's like language that you're learning as a 2 or 3 year old. You don't really learn it; you just absorb it, and then suddenly you know it. You know, if anyone has raised a child, all of a sudden they start using like grammar that you've never taught them and that they have just picked up. They don't always do it right. They'll throw ed at the end of a word that we don't do that with, but they're getting the patterns right. And so I think for this person, it was like developed, kind of almost intuitively. I don't know if they could teach it. Really fascinating stuff. I also want to just point out that not all deaf people are always deaf. So that some deaf people who are in the experiment easily could have heard sound through much of their life, but were deaf at one point. And
Yes.
So we don't want to kind of assume all deaf people are deaf forever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
it's true.
The in that particular case too, the thing that fascinated me about the story was almost less about the echolocation and almost more about the mom, who was just like
Resilient.
Yeah, exactly. She was in her mind. She was willing to come up with an idea that to everybody else seemed like she was being cruel to her kid by asking him from a very, very young age to learn how to use this methodology that was, I think, by most rational standards, people thought that she was doing something that was not in the best interest of her son. And she was like, but I'm not going to teach him victimhood behavior. This is who he is. This is a limitation that he has that he's not going to get back. So I'm going to teach him how to have something that makes sure he doesn't feel like a victim. And I was like, oof, she must be a very interesting woman to have had that level of focus to create an idea like that. That's almost, to me, as interesting as the young man who figured out how to use the echolocation. Like love was its own language that she needed to use to tap into an idea to be able to be profoundly different than what anybody else could think of. Because to her, it wasn't, does echolocation work? It's, can my son live his best life? That's a powerful tool.
For sure.
Any other thoughts that are coming up from the language side of where we're
I have one.
okay?
Which is just the interesting. I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about body language, and I just think it's interesting how that's missing from so much of our communication now online. That has been something that I have experienced. Why that can be incredibly detrimental to people's relationships with other people, and I wonder what kind of solutions there might be to that problem. Obviously, there are other kinds of online communication tools that allow people to have more context, but it doesn't seem to be the most popular form of communication.
Well, I think when you look at like traditional text-driven communication, so like something like a letter or a book, 100 years ago now, the language was very, extensive. It was descriptive. It's not the same way we communicate while we're texting on the phone or texting in on a post online or something, and we use a much more conversational language, which is based on all these other cues that you get that you don't have when you're online. I don't know if there's a real solution, but I like really direct and expressive communication in general. I think it's usually the way to go. And I know amongst my like close friends that we kind of have a rule of like, if something is supposed to be sarcastic or taken in a kind of jokeful way, you should be kind of recognizing that in some part of the text, like like with an emoji or with something that lets me know, this is don't take me too seriously right now. I know that's not common, but I'm a kind of older person, so that's how I deal with this world. But I think that's the challenge, right? Is that we write in the modern age. We write how we talk, not how we write, right? And that's different. We're not writing like we're writing a novel. You can read a novel and you're not confused over people's emotions because everything is being described to you, right? Whereas when someone shoots you a text or it replies to your post online or something, there's a lot of figuring out what did they mean, what did they say, you know, they do this on purpose the way they wrote this. Is it supposed to be an attack on me? And you don't get a lot of that, you know, that extra information.
So do you think our use of language is improving based on the direction that we're going, or do you think that we're losing something right now, you know, in the way that this is all playing itself out? Or as humans, are we losing a sense that took us thousands of years to develop? Are we starting to just give up on that?
I think increased discourse, but decrease in quality, in my personal view. We're talking a lot more to each other than we ever have, but we are more kind of separate. And I think a lot of times our communication is really shallow. You know, it's not the deep communication that we traditionally had when we were meeting, you know, in a public place, a third place, you know, again, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, you know, your Elks Club or your bar at night or whatever it was. We're not having those spaces. And I heard someone, this is not my idea, but I really appreciated it. They're saying, you know, we've had so much more communication with ourselves where it has created more intimacy in some places. Like you can text your girlfriend or your wife all throughout the day, every second of the day, which you couldn't do 50 years ago. You talk to them like in the morning and then at the end of the day or whatever, just very, you know, specific times. And so we're communicating with people we're close with more than we ever have, but we're communicating less than the people in our community than we ever have been because we don't need to engage them because so much of our important stuff is like siloed in these little places. So I think we improve our conversations, we improve our language, we improve our discourse when we communicate with a larger, more diverse group of people. And if we're only communicating with the people we are already intimate with or the people who we all agree with, who may be in different parts of the world, but are all on our side, we're not really challenging our thinking or our language, you know, and so I think it's important for us to re-engage in our communities. I think it's the real solution to it all.
And so do you think it's the third spaces that need to come back to allow that to happen? Or like what's
That'd be
the
a wonderful
like
thing?
if we just
I
had to
mean,
brainstorm, what would be the solution to the problem? If the problem is that language is being condensed into short attention spans, but that language is so beautiful and so complex that it really requires complexity.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just about. I mean, there is an attention span issue. That is one piece of it. But I do think there's also this really interesting point about when we're communicating and we're all physically in the same space, we're communicating on lots of different levels. Like I'm talking, waving my hands around, you're reading my body language. There are parts of your brain that you may not ever be aware of that are like reading things from me that I am not aware that I am sharing. And I think that for me, I really only text people that I already know. Like I have a really hard time if I'm like on an app trying to meet people. I don't really use social media a lot. I don't want to text or communicate over social media with folks that I'm not close with. I know if I send a text to my brother, that I don't have to clarify that it's sarcastic because he already knows what I think, right?
Yeah.
And so if I say something that's clearly not aligned with what I think, he will read it in a sarcastic way because we have that already.
That almost feels like it taps into the feeling side of it too, because there's a certain level of friendship that comes with somebody who knows how to understand you so deeply that they don't look for bad intent. Right? They know you so well that they know no matter what you're texting them, it's either funny or it's exactly what you were trying to say, but there isn't a version of a text that you send that is going to be nasty or cruel or any of the things that people are on high alert to, you know, think that somebody else is trying to perpetrate upon them in the way that they're doing it.
I think for a lot of people too, it's harder to say certain things when you're in a room face to face with people. You know, it's a lot easier to be a jerk out in the world when there's no accountability for you. You know, as opposed to if I'm sitting here next to Lisa and I get nasty at her, you know, she's gonna have a response to that. You know, whereas if it's online, I can say whatever I want and no repercussions for me. Right? Like it's just a thing. And so that provides a certain amount of accountability when you're sitting next to someone and you want to talk to them. If you're you know in kind of arm's reach with someone, you have to kind of face that you know you're looking them right in the eye and upsetting them or something, and that's harder to do than it is to do online.
Well, you have to be a part of the consequence.
Yeah.
Because if one of us was to do something to the other one in this room, then we would also have to sit with the feelings of what it is for that person to be uncomfortable, and then we'd have to deal with how do we interpret that.
when you had mentioned earlier, 98% of people that you have experience with are good. I think it's true that most people don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to make someone else uncomfortable.
Right.
Most people don't want that.
Yeah.
But when you are anonymous and there's these layers of protection,
Yes.
it's a lot easier to react, rather than respond, right? Just
Right.
Whereas in person, it's a lot easier not easier, but it's more advantageous to take a moment to consider, read the room,
I also think that when we're talking in person, we're talking on several different layers, and I'm curious on your take on this,
Yeah.
because I know that like one of my favorite jokes is if somebody asks me like, "Can you hand me a pencil?" I say no. And then I smile and I get the pencil and I hand it to them. And we've just had 2 conversations, right? Like I'm telling a joke, but I want to help you. Like I'm funny, but we're close enough as friends that I can be funny. And I do this even to people that I don't know well, because in person I can pull off all those different layers and they're picking up things that I'm saying without words.
It's endearing.
Right. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on there. So I'm curious about your take on like language, the layers of in-person communication.
Yeah, I absolutely think that in person does convey a lot more about what we're really feeling. And also, I think what's very interesting is the lens that we're receiving the information from is all unique, each individual person. And I think that when we certain things that someone might say to us might trigger us that we are receiving as something different than what they mean. And the person may think they're being genuine and kind, and we're receiving it as they weren't so nice. I think when we're in person, we can get more conversation about what's really going on if the person who's receiving something is able to speak what they're really feeling to the other person and let them know how they're feeling. Especially when it's triggered by something that's feeling negative about it, then the person has a chance to be, oh, I didn't mean it that way, this is what I meant. I think in communication with language, we often don't take into consideration what we're saying to another, especially when we don't know them, that they are receiving what we're saying different from what we meant. Does that make any sense? And I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but it's about, there's so much to language that when we first understand our own self with what our triggers are, then communication and relationships get so much better. And I feel like language is the way, if we're in person, our feeling side, our intuition, our auric field's energy is a frequency that we're communicating sub to unconsciously with every living thing around us. When we can learn about that and how that has an effect, then everything gets so much better. But we're not taught any of that, really. So that's where I come from, like with what I try to teach people is their feeling side, their frequency, and how it interacts with every living thing. I know I'm getting off subject.
No,
and this
not at
is
all.
because
I actually
it's-
want to just see if we can stay here for a while, because I think what you're talking about is fascinating. I'm just going to share with you what I was thinking as you were talking, but the first thing that was going through my head was, who's responsible for the reaction? Is it the person who is expressing a thought, or is it the person who is receiving the thought? Because both are so dynamic and complicated, because if you are fully responsible for the way that someone receives something, then you can see really quickly how you would start to mutate your truth to make sure that you weren't putting yourself and them in a situation where you had to deal with whatever that is. And yet on the other side, if you are hearing something through your own interpretation, is that the other person's responsibility to be able to nurture you into some simpler understanding of what it is?
That's a really good question.
I think I would have had one opinion when I was younger, and I have a different opinion now,
Yeah. I think it's really important to not change what you authentically want to say to the other person in conversation. But having said that, it all depends on the situation. Like at work, like if you have a team and you understand that some people are very sensitive, you can change how you're going to say something to meet the person where they're at, so that you you know if they are very sensitive, that you can lessen how you're going to deliver something to meet them so that they're not taken back by it. But in general, I think it is not our responsibility for how the other person receives anything, which is a lot to think about and to learn about. However, when you recognize in person that that other person was just triggered, because you're going to see it. You're going to see it in their body language, in their face, in their eyes. Then you can have the conversation with, do you understand what I just meant with what I said? Because I think you might have taken it a different way than I'm trying to imply. So can we talk about that before you move on to something else? But the person receiving it, when they are offended by it or anything, if they don't have the ability to let you know that how they feel, then they're missing the opportunity to have the conversation be better in the end, to get to the bottom line of what it all is about. Does that make sense?
Total sense. I think it's just a really interesting topic to continue to explore, right? Because there's so much to the dynamic of being able to be assertive in what it is that you feel. I think you said something earlier where you're saying when you and your friends talk, the language that you're trying to talk in is direct, and making sure that there's a right time to text, there's a right time for a phone call, and there's a right time to go to a third place and meet each other and share whatever that is. It's very complicated, though, because I think part of what we're talking about is not only that there's there's language, but then there is intent behind language. So there's empathy, there's sympathy, there's apathy. You can hear all of those clear as day. I know the difference for sure when somebody's like, "You're in my thoughts and feelings," between when somebody's like, "Hey, listen, I'll get into the trench with you for a little while. You know what I mean? And I'll stay here and we'll figure out what it is that you're going through, and then we got to get out of here." The difference between those two places is a friend. One is somebody who is going to go to apathy as soon as they give you a thought bubble, and the other one is somebody who's going to actually get out of the trench with you, and so that you can be together. So I don't know, I'm infinitely fascinated with this idea of, I keep trying to figure out, people keep asking these big questions about what we can do to try to solve social structures, but it doesn't feel like you can solve a single social structure without starting here first.
Exactly.
It feels like everything has to start with the individual, and if you don't do that, then socially there is no way to be able to control the contagion of victimhood thoughts, I guess, is one way to say it. I don't think that that's fair, because it feels like it is too tight of a phrasing, but I don't know another way to say it. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on any of that.
I've thought on intent, and it's a weird. It's going to feel like a weird analogy, but bear
Love
with
it.
me for
Let's
a second.
roll with it.
Yeah.
This guy Donald Norman, he's an author, writes about design, great books. I highly recommend any of them. But he's got one about complexity, and he talks about salt and pepper shakers in at a restaurant. And he says, if you ask anybody, which one is, you got one with one hole, one with 3 holes in it, but otherwise they're identical. If you ask anyone which one is salt and which one is pepper, everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a reason for their opinion. Not everyone agrees. But it doesn't actually matter when you sit down and you grab, and your mindset says 1 hole is salt, 3 holes is pepper. Which, if you disagree, I'm not trying to start an argument.
That's a hot take, though. For sure.
So he says it doesn't matter what you think in that moment. It doesn't matter what your belief is in that moment, because there was another person and they filled them, and they have to agree with you, right? So they had to think 1 hole is salt, 3 holes is pepper. For you to, their intent has to match your intent for you to come to a common representation here. But his solution is so simple, and I think it's actually the solution to a lot of what we have. And he says, you just use transparent salt and pepper shakers. Don't use opaque ones. Use ones you can see through, right? And that goes back to kind of what we were just talking about. From my perspective of communication, is like direct, open, transparent communication is probably going to get us to most places better, even if it's painful, even if it's difficult, than if we're trying to match intents, which is, I think, one of the hardest things for humans to communicate. As you're saying, like, I say a thing, you don't necessarily know what I actually mean because of the complexity of expression. Right. But the more transparent and open we can be, the more patient we can be, the more we can realize that other people don't have to agree with one whole, three whole thinking, that I don't have to rely on those ideas. I can just, be open and transparent. So I think that's a really important view for us as a society to have, that we need to come together and like understand that we can both be totally justified in our thinking, but come to different conclusions, but still find a way to come to common ground by being open and transparent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because all that matters is that you either get the salt or the pepper that you want on your food, if that's what you're trying to, So in the end, I think the thinking that I've tried to go into is that it's all about outcomes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that it took me a long time to learn this, and I would say the most pain that I've ever caused myself and that I've caused others in the language relationships that I've built with anybody throughout my whole life, is that I think that I have a propensity towards passive-aggressive language, because who knows, right? Nurture nature, but I was, I was the younger brother of two, and I found my role in my family oftentimes to be the one who was trying to make things light and easygoing, and I wanted people to like me. And that's the stage one, is figuring out how you get people to like you. And then stage two is like, how do you start to manipulate a room to make them like you by knowing how to use little things that make people endeared to you or make them feel comfortable or all of that stuff. But what you don't realize when you're trying to figure out those small games is that you don't realize that you're also building a repertoire of passive-aggressive strategies that aren't allowing you to get to something that is an effective tool. And as far as I know, the only effective way to communicate is by being assertive. I would argue, especially after being a father and trying to run a business, that the only way that I've ever found that is truly effective is always compassionate, always honest. And in that order, always thoughtful about what somebody else's perspective is first, and then always willing to give mine without any trying to pull back on what it is that I'm actually thinking, to make sure that we at least can level ourselves in that conversation to the greatest degree. But who knows, right? Like, who knows whether that's something that you're experimenting with all the time, I think.
I think a lot of sort of the couching of communication is your assumption as to like what your relationship is with the other people in the room. Because I think being passive aggressive is you want something to change and you're assuming you don't have the power to change it, so you're coming at it sideways. That's been my experience with, when people are being passive aggressive, they want something to be different. They don't think that they can change it themselves, so they're coming at it sideways to sort of express that in an unempowered way, which, sucks when it's a person in a position of power, right? Like, if your teacher or your parent is being passive aggressive towards you, passive aggressive behavior, the person who's doing it feels like they're punching up, and if they're actually punching down, that can be really damaging and mess you up a lot. And I think it also, on the other side of things, if you are talking to people and offering an opinion and they can tell that your assumption is that you are correct and you are handing this opinion down to somebody who will be grateful to reach up and take it, they don't want it, And one of the things that I have been, sort of crafting as somebody who works a lot with a lot of different types of people is my ability to offer an opinion in such a way that they know that they can take it or leave it, right? I work a lot with teenagers, and so I'll say a thing like, I really don't think that you should go outside without shorts on. I'll even say things like, dude, that's dumb, you're gonna freeze. But when I phrase it as me speaking to an equal, I can say that thing, and they can take or leave that suggestion. And I think, a lot of my like there's humor and there's body language and there's all these other layers of communication where I'm saying, I'm telling you that I think what you're doing is wrong, but I have enough respect for you that if you choose not to take my thought, that's fine, and we can move on. And if you want to wear shorts outside, I'm going to tell you I think it's dumb, and you can still do it because it's your body. and we'll move on.
So it feels like what you're effectively doing is you're creating a relationship that feels real, and then you're allowing that realness to be able to be something that can be playful.
Yeah.
But from there, I wonder if we can continue that conversation just to say, like, real is so important to what language is, to find something that feels real. I'm very concerned for my kids and for everybody's kids. I know you said you had a daughter, I think. Yeah. I don't know how old she is.
13.
13, okay. So we have kids about the same age. And when sometimes when my kids come to me with a thought or an opinion about something, I keep asking them questions about where this is coming from. And especially when it's coming from social media, I'm like, whoa, you do understand that maybe you're talking to a real person. Maybe you're talking to a bot. Maybe you're talking to someone who is highly interested in manipulating the way that you're thinking about this given thing at any given moment. Tell me about your thoughts. Tell me about what are your instincts telling you about this? Because oftentimes we think about things like language and thinking as if it's something that we've already experienced in another century. But we are in the middle of an experiment right now that no other, as far as I know, no other civilization that we are completely aware of has ever gone into anything like what social media has become and what the way that we use technology to communicate. Yeah. And that has to be having a massive effect on us. And we're a part of an experiment that I think we all signed up for, but maybe we didn't quite know what we were signing up for.
Yeah, most of us clicked a box somewhere.
Yeah, or
if you can call that signing up for it.
Yeah, so Alex, I don't know if this relates, like you tell me if this is true for you, but I'm 44 years old, so I know for sure that I had an analog childhood, but then I came into a digital adulthood. But I know for sure that I'm raising two young men who have only lived in a digital world. Yeah. There's a big difference in my feelings about what it was to come home from school and go out and play manhunt in the woods than it is to come home and sit down in front of a video game and hope that you're talking to somebody on the other end of headphones that are going on there, right? Like I feel differently about what that was for me in the woods than I feel like I'm not doing my job to make sure that they're out in the woods, and yet it's very difficult to get anybody out in the woods anymore.
It's not where so for us, that's where the socialization was happening, is because I have this conversation with my child all the time. Go outside. We have railroad tracks. Go play on the railroad tracks. There's woods. Go play in the woods.
Please
like, these are the things we did as a kid, you know? I'm like, go do some reckless stuff. At 13, I was out doing, exploring the world and pushing my boundaries and finding my freedom, right? But there's no one out there. Her friends are on a little device, and that's where they are. And so we had this conversation a lot as she was growing up about, I don't really want you to spend time on these things. And I realized it was the same thing as me saying, like, I don't want you to go hang out in front of that 7-Eleven because that's where all your friends are, but it's not okay with me. And it's like, well, but that's where my friends are, You're like, well, you can either be not part of the friend group, right? Or you can be part of the friend group. You can't do it by not hanging out in front of 7-Eleven. You can't do it by, but it's just, the point is, no one is in the woods. I wish they were. I really do, like a little ruckus, a little freedom, a little getting in trouble. Her life experience seems so safe compared to my life experience, but mostly because I was putting myself in situations of danger.
Okay, but counter to that.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is really interesting about kids transitioning to socializing online. I'm 21. I'm like on the tail end of millennials. I'm the oldest in my family, so I was a little bit like not super aware of some things that were going on. So I would say I stepped into technology around, like in middle school, we used to go on GChat, on Gmail, and message each other after school, and that's sort of where things started to become more technologically based.
Did you say 21 or 31?
29.
29.
Oh, I thought you said 21. I was
yeah,
like,
I did
whoa.
too. Yeah.
No,
Okay,
sorry,
29.
29.
Okay. I was like,
tail end
wow.
of the millennium. I'm going to be 30 this year.
Congratulations.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you. We did it. And one thing that I think about a lot is the fact that when kids go out and play in the woods, when that was like the common experience, they would come home. You would go home at the end of the day, and your grown-ups, as we say, would know what the dangers were in the woods, right? Like, they know what the dangers are in front of 7-Eleven. They can be like, yo, so was there a bear? Was there somebody doing drugs? What went down? When I was on the internet as a child, our parents, and also the parents, I think, of Gen Z, and also now, parents don't know what's hanging out on the internet. We're getting better about it, right? Like as millennials become parents. But there's definitely this interesting window of time where we had an internet that was almost completely unregulated and kiddos who were wandering around in spaces that their parents didn't know they were in and parents didn't know what they were encountering. So the idea of, you know, like your kid goes out, does something dangerous, comes home, you say, oh, you scraped your knee. Did you fall over in the 7-Eleven parking lot? Let's talk about it. That's not happening because when we were finding scary and dangerous things online, nobody knew.
Right. And young people very rarely have the incentive to be able to express that to people because it's so goddamn exciting to find things that you know you shouldn't be finding. And that's
Right.
part of adolescence. It's part of going out into the train tracks. It's part of, you know, you need to be pushing those boundaries to figure out where is my comfort zone and can I go just far enough out of this comfort zone so I understand what it feels like to be alive. And then can I stay alive long enough to become an adult so that I can teach somebody else how to do that same thing.
And when you're encountering dangerous things as a forming brain with an adult, they give you the language to understand the dangerous thing.
Here's
Not
one
happening
complexity, though, that I think is really, I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on, is that if you're playing on the train tracks and a train is coming, that's dangerous.
Sure.
You know, you if you get hit by that train, like if you're online and you step into some seedy website or to something, you're not going to die, but it is going to set something up in your brain that can have long-term ripple effects that unless you have somebody who has the extraordinary ability to be able to bring you back to the point of contact where that ripple began, you may never even understand that the struggles that you have are related to seeing something that no one could explain to you. So it's like there's physical danger and then there's mental danger. And it's like we're in a social experiment right now of doing extremely mentally dangerous things that nobody is even looking at to try to figure out how we contain that. And you're 100% right at 30. I would imagine that you are the tip of the spear of a group of people who were good enough online to be able to find anything that you wanted and leave no trace behind that anyone that was older than you would ever know about.
Right. Right. And, you know, when I was messing around on the internet in, you know, like 2008, middle school age, you know, there were things that were being posted online that weren't being regulated. And I think one of the biggest ones that I think of is just different types of violence, right? Nowadays, if you want to find violence on the internet, you have to specifically look for it. But at a certain time in the internet's history, you know, violence was just there and you would just stumble across it.
That's because that's when we were like corporations hadn't quite figured out how to make money off the internet. So the internet was still very open and
Right.
free and unregulated.
Right.
People just do anything in the early 2000s, the mid early 2000s is definitely a different internet than the internet we have today. Once social media became prevalent and people found ways to monetize things, really changed the game, even what we were communicating. It's why I think communication has changed so much. I don't think it's necessarily the advent of social media that has made us worse at communicating. I think it is the capitalization of our interactions that has driven that, because it is the need to drive us into these profitable silos to be able to identify us and find the traits so that we can be better marketed and sold, not necessarily sold to us, but rather our information being sold to other corporations so that they can then better target us. You know, it's not like Facebook isn't trying to necessarily sell me a thing, but they're definitely selling me to somebody else, you know, or any of these social media platforms.
That's crazy. That's yeah. The idea of driving conversation into silos on the internet, and the fact that the process of labeling people is so inherent in the functionality of that is actually. I haven't necessarily thought about that before, but it's interesting because it does create a very polarized world just by the very mechanics of the way that happens.
Well, just to tie it into language and labeling, which you mentioned earlier, like if you remember Cambridge Analytica scandal from like the first Trump presidency, the big thing on that was that they were able to. Obama's the first like social media president who uses social media data to like target election data, presidency stuff to like drive his campaign to be like voted for, right? What the Trump Trump campaign is able to do, and not just them directly, but all of the people in their sphere, is with Cambridge Analytica, the nuance of Facebook's labeling. It used to be like man, woman, progressive, liberal, these very broad, kind of old school, 44 to 59 categories. It became so much more nuanced and much more personality trait driven than like demographic category driven, so it was like aggressive, it was, you could mark these personality traits, which is a different kind of marketing, right? You can find a group of people who are, susceptible to a certain kind of language and drive them into making certain kind of decisions. And
It's a manipulation.
it really is. I mean, they really took it, and Facebook has hired like more psychologists. I don't know if it's true currently today, but 15 years ago, there was a statistic that Facebook had hired more psychologists than any other business in the entire world, right? Because they're doing.
What an interesting thing to do with your psychology knowledge. Like, I understand people well. I think I'm going to go work for Facebook and influence their decisions.
But it's really interesting problems too, though. Like, so I know this was early Facebook days. They did this came out way after they did the research, but they were doing a little bit unethical because they didn't necessarily, report to people that this was happening to them. But they did something like they showed two different things, and I don't remember the research details too much, so I can't really be super specific. But they showed that when they showed people positive things, they responded more positively, and they showed people negative things, they responded more negatively. It seems pretty simple, but they were able to like prove this. You guys remember that they have like at the time probably hundreds of millions, but now billions of users. They can run a psychological experiment at a scale that no one, or sociological experiment at a scale that no one has ever been able to. And they had another one where they just put I voted, people who post I voted, if they then put that on someone's timeline, that person was also then most likely to report that they had voted.
Yeah.
So you could, it was never reported they did this, but you could, if you wanted to sway, a point of view, just show I voted to more people on one particular persuasion
True.
than of another one, and then theoretically get more people to vote for one than the other one, right? And so that social manipulation, I think, is a big part of tying it back to language, a big part of what's going on with social media and the language that is all around and wrapped around that.
Are you guys familiar with personality testing? Like, have you ever done disc profiles or
And like
anything?
Myers-Briggs and stuff.
Yeah. So I, because of the training that I was doing, I had to get certified in doing disc profile training. And then I delivered this disc profile training for many, many years. And I started to become very disgusted with myself for using these, because what I very, very quickly figured out is that all I was doing was I was giving somebody a opportunity to be able to explain themselves through a series of questions that they had no control over. And all of the questions were tapping into their egocentric thoughts. So it was just an opportunity for them to be able to reflect on themselves in some way. And then you would feed that information back to them as if you were telling them something profound about themselves that they already just told you that they already knew. And then afterwards, at least the way that it was used in industry, was that they would usually take these profiles and they'd say, you're a D, you're an I, you're an S, and you're a C. And it would be like, so if you run into a C, this is how you get them to buy what you want. If you run into a D, this is how you, and I was like, wait a second. When you say get them to buy, what you're actually saying is this is how you manipulate somebody to do something against their best interest. What the fuck? You know what I mean? And we've normalized so many different versions of that. So when you were saying people who have a skill of psychology, now that oftentimes comes from somebody who's been to institutions, who has learned the philosophy. But in my opinion, the difference between Freud's philosophy on the way that he interpreted the mind versus, other psychological teachers is a massive difference in which ones got into the books and which one pharmaceutical companies decided was in their best interest. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to that. But in the end, I think what we have to look at is there a level of, once a business gets involved in trying to figure out how they can make money, what's the difference between manipulation and marketing? And the marketing is all psychological. Mm-hmm. If you stop watching the news or you stop watching television, if you take enough time off of it, so I stopped watching the news probably a year or two before COVID, and then I've gradually weaned myself off of, I never use social media, but I've been gradually weaning myself off of television altogether. And now I essentially just watch Survivor because I think it's the greatest show ever. But the in that, what now if I turn on like a sports game, if my kids want to watch the World Cup or something, and there's a commercial that comes on, I'm like, is this how dumb they think we all are?
I know.
Is it like when they sell you laundry detergent? Is this what they're telling women that they should think of themselves when they do laundry? Is this what they're telling men that? And then I think like, oh man, did I ever watch a television show when I was a kid that didn't teach me that all fathers were sort of bumbling idiots and all mothers and women were supposed to be portrayed in this way? Is that why I thought that was true? I mean, the depth to the amount of time that we have spent being given a narrative about what our reality is that may or may not be in line with what your reality really is something that we've got to discuss because it's massive.
Yeah.
I think marketing is manipulation.
I do too.
It's all
I
it
think
is.
even like I remember
of
from
it's
my
sales.
childhood. I was born in 1977, so we're talking a few years older than you.
Yeah.
All of the shows, like all the Saturday morning cartoons, which maybe you don't even know. Maybe you didn't even experience those, but we all watched Saturday morning cartoons. It was when there was no kids television on except for Saturday morning, but they were all a cartoon that had a toy. So often the toy would have been invented and the cartoon was made. They always were like promoting every aspect of whatever this toy was through the television show. It was all intertwined while there were like ads for cereal for that, also for that thing is like this mass marketing to children, like directly to children. There was no parents around while we were watching Saturday morning cartoons. That was time for parents to be like, great, you're busy.
Right.
I'm out of here. And we just had this like, this entire buffet of commercialism just being shoved down our throats every minute.
And we loved
we
it.
did- well, we-
Saturday
our
mornings
brain
were the
loved it.
best.
Yeah.
When you woke up and you could just you could go get in front of whatever they were putting out there to you. It was amazing.
The one time you could control the television, right?
Which-
Because the rest of the time it was parents are watching this. You,
Right.
you would just sit by it, right?
Right.
It was colorful. It was engaging. It was
Yes.
directed towards you directly.
So I'm super interested, Lisa, to know more because you seem to have like a really deep understanding of how feelings, not only how we could interpret them, but also maybe how feelings are so intertwined with our nervous system that if you decide that you want to be somebody who is manipulative of somebody else, that you could understand that if I give this little kid a little bit of a dopamine hit by getting them to watch this, then that dopamine hit will start to train them like Pavlovian to start to gravitate towards this. And it may never end for the rest of their life. They might buy Kellogg's products forever as long as I get them to get this nervous system reaction to what that is. I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation because I think that we need to talk about it. I think it has to be talked about whether that is sustainable for the human race to be treating each other as if we are somehow each other's commodities.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to that, but I think the way I'd want to approach that is we, a long time ago, I don't know when, but probably the 50s or even earlier, propaganda, started. We were taught to not think about our intuition. It's all in the mind now, more than it ever was, I think, before. And all these things have already been done. And we all know that, like all of this, in the social media, all of it, we are just programmed, really, if you want to call it that. Maybe not programmed is the right word, but we have been conditioned to just believe what we're told in many ways. And our feeling side, our intuition, your gut instincts is your energetic body. We have our energetic body and we have our human intellect mind. And they're connected and they're communicating all day long through your feeling side. And your energetic body knows your truth. It knows what is best for you. And we all know this feeling, like say you're going to go and do something and you have that gut feeling, I shouldn't do this, but you do it anyway. And then after you're like, I knew I shouldn't have done that because X, Y, Z happened.
Oh my God, I've been through 2 divorces.
Yeah.
I can definitely tell you.
Exactly.
And
Oh my God, I walked down I won't even get in there, a little too personal. But anyways, I was saying walking down the aisle thinking, run. So we have been, I think, manipulated to not listen to our gut instincts. And that's where I believe the change needs to start in the individual. Needs to be taught to learn all the things, get all the information, compile all the evidence and all the things, and then get out of the mind with a deep breath and drop into the heart space, your feeling side, and it is your compass of what is right for each individual person. And feel it. With this decision I'm about to make, is this truth for me? You will feel it, a yes or a no. And that is how we should walk through our lives. And so most people have never heard of that before in that context of doing that.
Isn't that wild? Isn't that insane?
Because how could they when we're just taught something completely else?
Well, when you're in a pattern, you don't necessarily see the pattern,
right.
right? You have
Yeah.
to step
You're
out of it
unaware
to
of
be
it.
able to observe it.
And then, I'm not going to get into a long subject about this, but like our food, like there's so much chemicals or sugar, which is diminishing our pineal gland from being active to be able to feel our feelings.
Right, so that brain
So
fog
there's
that you
that
get even
whole thing, like there's so much in the environment that has been part of our lives that is preventing us from feeling, and medications, all kinds of things. When we can understand the energy body fully, that's when I think change can begin.
Can
And
I ask a
it's-
question to
yeah.
of all three of you? Have you ever had a moment in your entire life where your gut was wrong? If you reflect back on it and you think about all the times where your gut was telling you something, regardless of whether you made that decision or not, is there a single moment in your entire life where your gut was wrong?
I think if I said yes, people would say, then you weren't listening to your gut. So I think it's
Exactly.
kind of a tricky question.
It
because
can
maybe
be,
you weren't
yeah.
in tune enough, right? Like maybe you
Yeah.
just weren't in tune enough to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily like, I love the gut because like we are finding in like reality that like there's a bunch of gut bacteria that are controlling our behavior and stuff.
Yeah, because it's
So,
really
like,
so
not the
intuition.
gut. It's really not
yeah,
the
but I think
gut.
what you mean
It's
by
just
the gut
that's
is
how
really just your
people-
intuition. Like,
Yeah.
Intuition,
You tie
yeah.
into your
Yeah.
like.
Yeah,
you
gut
feel
is like a
Yeah.
slang term.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah,
but,
yeah.
but
But
intuition.
I think it's careful. Language and
No,
words
no,
are
no.
both-
You're
Yeah.
absolutely
We
right.
are finding that
100%.
actually
Yeah, I was gonna
gut
say.
instinct might actually have a real valid idea to it. As we.
So do you think your
Does.
intuition has ever been wrong?
I think that if you are truly like in touch with yourself and the situation, that your intuition tends to lead you in the best direction for like immediate decision making. For like what do you have to do in a moment? I think at times I think gathering lots of data to like help inform a decision is a really smart move. Depends what you want to do.
It's great.
I think honestly, with like things like interpersonal relationships, certainly your instinct is far better tool than like looking back at like years of conversation to try to analyze what has been going on in your
Right.
in your relationship with somebody, right?
Which
So-
naturally becomes transactional.
yeah, and so I think it depends on the situation, and I think it's easier to trust your instinct in certain situations than it is in others. But I'm a big proponent of listening to yourself as certainly as one of the main tools we can use to help decide what we want to do in any given moment.
Yeah.
I think instinct is also. I often think of instinct as not instinct like within a specific like intuition. Sorry,
It's okay.
as our way to describe information that we don't fully understand. Right, like our brain is processing things and our body is processing things that we're not aware of. And so I think gut feeling. It's not a crazy coincidence that we've been using the phrase gut feeling for a long time, and now we're learning that we have bacteria in our gut that's interacting with our brain. Like there is information that we are processing that we could feel. We're like, oh yeah, like I feel this is important. I'm aware this is important. I can't explain why. Maybe one day we'll figure it out, and now we're like uncovering all this information about gut bacteria that's explaining why we feel that way. But I think a lot of time intuition is your subconscious brain and different parts of your body processing information that you're not consciously aware of, like collecting data that you wouldn't be able to write down, right? And one like super easy example of that is sometimes if you are going to a place that you have been to before but you don't have it written down on the map, if you turn off your thinking brain, you'll just automatically go there, right? there's a
Autopilot.
part of your subconscious that is collecting that information and does know that. And so there's a lot of times where I'll say to myself, I have a feeling that I should go left instead of right. I don't know why, but I also know that my subconscious brain has so much information in it that I don't have conscious access to, that's important information. And I also really like explaining that way of thinking about it to folks who are really, really data driven, to be like, yeah, no, like there is data. The data exists. It's just you just can't access it and process it the way that you can other data, because it's in parts of your brain and body that we haven't brought forward into language.
It's like something that cold readers do, like people who cold read other people. It's like and probably you have a natural gift towards it, as you're saying, you're really good at reading a room, is that you're intaking a lot of unconscious or subconscious information that you're then processing without even realizing you're processing it,
Right.
Yes.
Or you can train yourself. Obviously, people who want to cold read or anything, can
Yeah.
train themselves to do it as well. But that noticing that larger stuff we've subconsciously or unconsciously, I think is a really valid point.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, as a teacher, I'd be fascinated with your perspective, but I think part of the reason why I have the ability to be able to read a room is also because I have an inability to be able to hold on to a ton of information. So if you put me in front, like if you wanted to, I think I was of a generation that didn't get this diagnosis, but I think if I was a child today, they probably would have labeled me as dyslexic. And so if you put, if I'm consuming information and then you're asking me to regurgitate that information, I don't think that I'm going to impress anyone. But if I can walk into a room and I allow my intuition just to focus on the emotional feel of the room, then I don't have anything blocking my ability to do that. I've known other people who are extraordinarily information-driven intellectuals who I have learned so much from, and I'm so grateful for their gift. But I can also tell that when they get into a room, they're like, okay, what does that say? What does this do? And they aren't able to kind of tap into the other thing. I don't think it's about one being better or worse than the other. It's just about us celebrating each other.
Well, I'll grade you based on facts. Like I want to assess you based on your grades. Like how well do you understand this? But when I'm giving a lesson, I can feel if it's not landing right.
Yes.
I'm not questioning people or trying to like discern that like look on their face to see, are they just nodding in agreement out of habit, or are they actually it's just you can feel the room just feels confused.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
feel it in the air. And that's where you have to pivot. But I don't want to grade someone that way. That's a
Right.
terrible way to grade. Like I feel like you deserve a C. I get a lot of like fights from my students. But I think that you have to rely on both those things at different times, right? That's
Yeah. Well, and the feeling of a C is authority.
yeah.
Sorry, Lisa.
No, that's okay. I wanted to touch on what you said about feeling the air.
Yeah.
Because that is so true. So language is so many different things. There's our language, words, the languages, all the different languages. Our sensory part of our bodies is a language. And every thought, every word has a frequency that goes with it. And when we're thinking, especially speaking out loud, the frequency of the words I'm saying right now are going into the air. And when a person is talking and they're positive, meaning that they are in a balanced state, they're not fear-based thinking, they're not in the emotional states of like anger, frustration, resentment, all the lower vibrational thought forms. They're in positive. It is filling the air with a positive charge. When people are thinking fear-based, emotions, anger, frustration, resentment, even sadness, grief, all those lower vibrational, shame, thought forms, that frequency is in the air. And we are walking around with an auric field's energy that emanates about 18 inches off of us, and we're absorbing what's in the air. And I'll use this as an example. If you're in a really good mood and you go into a party, you can instantly feel the room if there's anger going on in the party, but you can feel that something's wrong. You're like, what's going on? Not only are you feeling it and understanding it in your mind, but if everyone in the room is mad and you're happy and positive, it's hard to maintain being happy and positive because their energy has filled the room with so much negative charge that it comes into your auric field's energy and into your body and it takes you down.
100%.
Yeah, and so what happens with that is by being aware of it, which we're not taught really, you can stop yourself from being taken down, because all you have to do is keep your mind's thoughts positive. It's really not easy to do. I'm not saying it's easy to do, and there's so much more to what I'm saying here that we can't get into tonight. But words have meaning, and they have effect on every living thing around them. What we need to do to change the way the world is we need to teach people about the vibration of their thoughts and how they're expressing. Because we do have choice in every moment of how we want to say something. When we're triggered, like say I said something to you that really, you were so mad, especially if you knew me.
Sure.
You're going to react before you can act in a more balanced way when it hits a thorn, is like what I like to call it. And when people can learn, not you, when I say you, I mean people, when we can learn to not react, we're going to be hit by that thorn and we're going to feel it, and it's going to take our emotion into that lower vibration. But when we can be aware, okay, that just hit my thorn, I'm going to take a step back and just take a deep breath, and I'm not going to react. I'm going to act from a balanced state. And if you can't balance because it's something really awful or hard, then that's when you just agree to not have the continued conversation right now because I'm too emotionally charged right now. I want to continue this conversation, but it can't happen right now, because when we're emotionally charged and we're in these thought forms, it's never going to be a good end result in the conversation.
So the outcome is always dictated by the
emotion
feel of the
behind it.
vibration
Yeah.
that the people are
Yeah.
giving each other.
And when we can learn to stop talking, having the conversation because we're not in a positive charge, and be okay to just revisit it, that's when relationships get so much better.
Yeah.
And it might only take 3 minutes. It might take 3 days. It all depends on what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But if the other person isn't able to do that, then the person who is balanced can, or the person who's aware of what all this is, can stop the conversation for the other person. Even if that other person's very upset because they're not going to be happy because they want a battle. Not engaging helps so much.
I think we're seeing a little bit more of this conversation too in like certain educational spaces of teaching kids to check in with whether or not they can continue. I'm seeing a little more of like, you know, us identifying that, you know, if a kid has anxiety, sometimes it's going to manifest as clamming up, and sometimes it's going to manifest as hyperactivity. And so you'll see trainings now as somebody who's working with kids of different ages saying, if you have the chance to ask the kid how they feel in their body, that's going to help them identify what's actually happening with them and whether or not they need space or to have a continued conversation, if they need to talk or they need to listen. And so I think there is a movement to sort of have more of this conversation about whether or not you feel safe in yourself and balanced in yourself before you continue an interaction.
Certainly was not part of our upbringing, but my 13-year-old, through her, at least in Lowell Public Schools, good for Lowell Public Schools, she has had like emotional regulation, like not classes, but education throughout, and identifying your emotional state and in communicating that. And, you know, they have like, you know, resources and things for students to help manage that stuff. You know, like even as simple as like pulling out fidgets, like, gosh, I wish we had those when I was a student. You know, these simple things that seem simple, but are really effective. And so I think it is changing. I think there is value. Now, there's certainly a group of Americans who think this is nonsense and we shouldn't be teaching it in public schools. But I'm really glad that my daughter, at least, has gotten it. It's something we talk about at home, too, a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I personally, actually, in my own interpersonal relationships, I'm working very hard on responding, not reacting, waiting to act, and trying to move away from conversations that are no longer productive in that moment, and happy to continue them later. It's something I'm actually currently actively working on. I find it so rewarding, but so difficult. Like, it has improved my communication drastically, but man, is it so hard to like keep my mouth shut and not respond immediately to a human who's upsetting me, right? Like, you know, but having to check in with my emotions to see why I'm upset, and you know, I want to say this, but what's the reason I want to say it? Like, what's the goal tied again back to language, like why do I want to say this right now? Is the goal to make me feel better and hurt you? Is the goal to prove to you that I'm righteous, that I'm right? Is the what is my intent here? Is it worth my time and energy to continue this conversation or even this point of view or whatever?
You just made me think of something really interesting, which is you just reminded me of, first of all, of an interesting sort of Viktor Frankl quote, which is that basically something along the lines of that human freedom lies in the space in between stimulus and response. And I think that has a really interesting context in language, especially I find in written language, because I think that written language is a really rigorous form of thought, but that maybe the most interesting thing about it is that if you have a stream of words that are appearing in your head, it seems to me fairly apparent that I don't really have a ton of control over that. Like those things kind of seem to just appear in my mind, but then what appears on the page, I get another level of conscious deliberation, and it's almost like the stimulus can be these thoughts, which is an interesting to think of the stimulus being internal words in your mind. But then that the output, you have actually a higher level of agency over in the same thing with the words coming out of your mouth, right? But it's just really interesting the way that we can try and create space in between, and even in a conversation, right? There's an input of someone else's words, and then there's another input coming into your system of the own words that are filling and populating your mind from God knows where, and then you get to, hopefully have some other thoughts about those thoughts before you then get to decide what's going to come out of your mouth or, that you're going to type out onto your device or whatever it may be.
So two things. One, I don't know if you guys heard a chime earlier, but that chime was for the 1 hour mark, and that probably happened maybe like 5 or 6 minutes ago.
That was 35 minutes ago.
Oh my
Really?
goodness.
Okay. Can I hop in super quick?
Yeah.
And ask for a brief break? I'm very sorry to do this, but I'm getting a headache, and I'm going to need to take some medication
100%.
to keep myself engaged in this conversation.
Let's take a break. Take
need
as
to go to the
long as you
bathroom,
need
too.
to, and then when you're back, we'll get kicked off again.
Perfect.
So,
I
no
really
problem.
appreciate it.
If anybody else needs to use the restroom, you're welcome to. When we come back to it. Okay, so just for anybody, first of all, we just started this podcast. So if I'm being honest with you, we probably have like 11 listeners who might listen to this thing. So for all 11 listeners who might be tuning in to this podcast, we took a quick break just so that we could reset ourselves, and we're now coming back into reestablishing. We got Oliver to get our equipment back up and going. It's really a lovely conversation, even while we were in break, though, and kind of talking through where this conversation has brought us. I would say for now, if you guys are comfortable with it, it might be a good time to jump into question 2.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that we have to change where we were heading with the conversation, but maybe it just kind of sparks the direction that goes in. So I'm going to slide this over to you.
Nice to get a new infusion. I'm not going to be so careful with the seal.
Go for it.
So nice.
Yeah, we got plenty of envelopes.
How does the way you think influence the way you live today?
I like that question. So I think of everything I've learned throughout my whole journey of this life and everything, I really have embraced what my thoughts are and how I think and incorporate it into looking at every single thing with the awareness of having it be in the positive, which I never even had that awareness before. And it really has helped make my life go with much more ease. And what I mean by positive is not fear-based thinking about it. And when I am fear-based thinking about it, that's okay too, because it's a time for me to reflect and see what's causing this, what's really going on here. But knowing that I don't have control over outcomes, or we were talking a little bit about other people's stuff, being able to let go of control has helped me tremendously. And so now I think with that in mind, it's hard to articulate what I'm trying to say, but I feel like my thoughts have really helped me to be a much better person. And it's helped me to have much more kindness and compassion and empathy. Where before, like 10, 15 years ago, I didn't have the knowledge that I have now, or I hadn't done the work on my inner self. And I was just running on a treadmill, you know, and I emit so much more ease. So my thoughts help me be at ease.
May I ask you a question,
Yeah.
and then maybe we can all pick up off of this question? But do you believe that you can control your thoughts, or do you believe that your thoughts are happening because of the environments that you're choosing to put yourself in?
I think that thoughts start off with whatever is being presented, and that starts off the thought process of everything. And I do think that I can control the chatter that's in my mind more than I ever could before. And that is very helpful. And I find it to
Liberating.
to be able to look at things that are hard to look at with more ease. And part of it is by letting go of controlling any outcome. Things are not always good, and nor will they be, and that's okay. The things that aren't good, I'm able to now see it as accepting it. I accept what I can't control. And that has helped me tremendously. Is that making any sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay.
I'm curious, for the two of you,
I think on a good day, I am in good control of my thoughts and I can direct them where I want. There are plenty of bad days where my brain is I have a brain that is full of thoughts constantly.
Yeah.
Just bursting with ideas. On a bad day, I can barely get my own thoughts in there. But on a good day, on a kind of average day, I'm somewhere in between. Yeah. But I think it definitely affects how I live my life. I mean, that's no question about that. Because on the days where I'm very clear, I feel like I have some of my best days, and on the days where I'm feeling overwhelmed, it's very hard to kind of process my own thoughts because of being bombarded by all these other ideas that are in my head. I like to build stuff and make stuff and fix things, and my brain is constantly trying to solve all these problems in my head. And sometimes there'll be like a piece of code I write computer code at times, and there'll be a piece of code in my head that's just rolling around in there, taking up all the space, and I can't get my own stuff in. I don't want to detract from it, but I'm a big person who has like a big into ethos and principle, and I think that's like the way I think, right? And I think it directly affects how I live. I constantly make decisions to try to maintain like the ethical point of view of the world that I would like to have. I'm like very strong ethical views, and I try to make sure that I live a life that adheres to those. I am far from perfect in it, but we strive for them, right? So I influence my life a great deal.
I don't know if what I'm about to say is true, but I love thinking about it, and I haven't figured out that it's not true yet, which is that if you don't base your life around living up to the characteristics that you find to be important, then the alternative of that is that you become a character, and that there might not be anywhere in between, that you either have to live for having character or you will live to become a character. And I haven't, in my own life, I have lived as a character, and I have also lived to try to find more of my own character. And I would never choose to go back to being a character. It's not a pleasant place to be. There's a ton of anxiety in that. There's a lot of things that feel very uncomfortable. I still feel very uncomfortable at times, but I don't feel like this. I don't feel like I'm lying to myself. And that level of deception, self-deception, is really damaging for the way that you can feel secure or insecure.
I'm okay with failing to meet my principles as long as I'm trying to be that person, right?
Yes.
Like I don't have to be the perfect person every day all the time, but if that's like the driving force, I think that's important.
Yeah.
And that's
One of
great.
the interesting things that's coming to mind for me is in terms of, your question, Brett, of whether you feel like you can control your own thoughts is like, there's no question that if I say don't picture an elephant, you failed, but with principles, you get, I think, to at a moment in time where you're capable of more conscious thought, you get to create something external of your own that can influence you at any moment. And I think that that's where a lot of the power that we have over ourselves lies, is in trying to, in moments of being deliberate, externalizing the things that we think are important to try and create an environment. Because principles, even if you don't write them down, they exist in an environment in your own mind that you encounter that can try and allow you to have more free will, as opposed to being beholden to the environment that exists or the environment that's being presented by someone else.
I think this might be why seeing each other as equals but not trying to be the same is such an important concept. So if you took something like monogamy, which I'm not saying is a good thing or a bad thing, but if you're dedicated to trying to be in a monogamous, meaningful relationship with another human being, then the chances of you being able to pull that off by going to bars every night is really, really low, right? But if you instead, you're like, you know what, I'm going to go home and I'm going to read something, or I'm going to consume something. I'm going to take on information that drives me more towards the importance of this principle, this idea, monogamy, whatever it is for that individual person. It just increases your chances of being able to be successful at whatever it is that you've set yourself out to do. I just have found the idea of thinking about it as being a good person or a bad person to be completely not fruitful. There is no difference. Everybody is capable of doing bad things, and everybody is capable of doing good things. The only thing that separates any human being from those two things is action. Mm-hmm. Are you choosing to fulfill getting to good consequences, or are you choosing to take actions that are likely going to send you in a direction that, if it doesn't automatically make a bad consequence, it certainly is heading in a direction where you have to fight a lot more to be able to avoid the bad consequence than you would if you had made other decisions?
I like to say none of the time that I spent worrying about being a good person made me a better person.
Oh, great line, yeah.
I love
I
that.
will also, not my line, but someone has pointed out that all supervillains believe that they are good people because they strongly adhere to principles that they believe are good and true. Like Lex Luthor fervently believes that Superman is a menace to the world, that like his power is dangerous, right? We look at him and go, he's a villain trying to destroy the good guy, but it's like they're two people who are strongly principled, living their principles, but their principles do not agree with each other.
Listen, if Christopher Nolan took on Superman, I think he could convince me that Lex Luthor was the good guy, and that Superman was the bad guy. It's the narrative that is so complicated about all of this stuff. Sometimes, too, I don't know if this has happened to anybody else, but I've had times in my life where I remember watching something from the point of view of when I was watching it and thinking, like, this person was good or this person was bad. The example for me, and I apologize because it's going to date me a little bit, but when I was younger, I really liked the show 90210. Like, to a pathetic degree, I kind of was into that show. And I remember thinking that Brandon from that show was like the example of what it was to be like a good guy in high school and do all the right things. And then the guy that drove the Porsche, Dylan, was like the example of what it was to like not be doing that. And then later on in my life, I went back and I watched that show again, and I was like, oh shit, I had it 100% wrong. Dylan was actually the guy who was very principled about the way that he did it. He just didn't care whether people gave him credit for it or not. And Brandon was just manipulating the shit out of everybody on his way to getting whatever he wanted, and it just looked like he was trying to do it from the position of playing the character that everybody could get behind. And I was, oh my God, I've misinterpreted all of this. Just opens you up to how much of life is about the perspective that you're taking at that given moment.
Exactly.
Which I think, Lisa, brings you back to the idea of like, can you get your frequencies so that you're only trying to figure out whether the frequency that you're coming in contact with feels like it's a match for, you know, for where you want to be. It's a really wonderful way to think about it and be able to imagine it.
Yeah. And also, I do want to say on that, it's also good to be with not your frequency. Like, because you're learning from that.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. So it's not like understanding yourself and your frequency and even your mindset, like your personality traits that are of your nature. It's great when you are with other people of that. It's just easy. But it's also great to have communication and relationships with people that aren't that. So you see from a different perspective. But when you're aware that their thought process is completely different from mine, it makes the dialogue or the conversation even that much more, because especially when you are doing what you want to do here and have everyone be equal and be open-minded to difference, you learn from it in another way than before without having the awareness of it. Am I making any sense? I know I always say that.
Lisa,
Like,
I feel like you're almost making so much sense that it is insane that you even have to ask the question that the idea that spending time with somebody who is different than you is the opportunity to learn. That is the most obvious thing that we could possibly establish, right? Like
Yeah.
you already know what it is to be you. So hanging out with somebody who's different than you is 100% nothing but opportunity.
right. Especially in the workforce. Like with teams, to understand the other ones, and I know you did that other, what was it called
The
that you
DISC
learned?
profiles?
Yeah,
Yeah.
profiles. And that was unfortunately used for manipulation to get what the business owners want in selling, you know. But when you can understand the other people who you are with in work, whether it be at school or anything, you're not frustrated by their way anymore when you've learned what their way is. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And the other thing about those DISC profiles that ended up being my technique for teaching it, and I would, you know, as another teacher, I'd love to know if you run into the same thing. But what I ended up doing was I still used the DISC profiles, but when we got to the point where we were starting to break down, okay, I'm a D, you're an I, you're an S, you're a C, we instead of trying to talk about it about, okay, so what can you do to attract an I to be able to do what you want, we would say, oh, what's our opportunity if we let go of our letters? What if we let go of our letters and we said, okay, I have a natural propensity for some reason to fall into these traits. What would my life be like if I could start to identify that, and then I could start to be traitless, and I could just I could get rid of as much identity as I possibly can, and I can just be with you, and then we can figure out what it is that we're trying to do. And every time we did it, it was a new kind of breakthrough. It was like the privilege of teaching that course changed my life significantly, because I had no ownership of what the outcome of that conversation was going to be once we started it. And I was just a passenger along with everybody else, just trying to figure out, like, whatever comes out of this is going to be interesting. And a lot of times it was crying, it was celebrations, it was a lot of different things. It was sadness that people had from feeling like they had spent 40 years of their life pretending to be something that they knew that they weren't. And then what's that realization make you think about how you are going to spend the rest of the time that you have trying to get closer to who you feel like you have what's your potential of what you can become is a very difficult thing to grab onto.
I think those sort of different ways of categorizing brains and ways of thinking are really interesting. And I like to think of them within the context of what you had mentioned earlier of approaching truth, right? Putting people into categories doesn't mean you've like definitively unearthed the truth of who they are, but we can approach a truth of communication if we understand, if we use that sort of labeling or that system to help build a bridge between different ways of thinking. One of my favorite ways that I've come across, it's not like Myers-Briggs, but there was this conversation I was reading once where people were talking about the difference between an asker and an inferrer, which is sort of more cultural than individualistic. But can sort of depend on a family, where an asker is where you're in a community where it's expected that if you want something, you ask for it, and if you can't have it, the other person will say no, right? So like, if I drink all my water and I want more water, I could say, hey, Lisa, can I have one of your waters? And if you don't want to give it to me, you'll just say no, and I won't be hurt by that. Whereas in other spaces, the implication might be for me to be like, oh man, I'm almost out of water. And then and then that gives you space to pick up on what I'm inferring and then offer if you're comfortable with it without me forcing you to say no if you're not. And when you get somebody who's an asker and somebody who is an inferrer in the same dynamic, you can end up with either me asking you for something and you feeling like it would be rude for you to say no, which is not my intention, right? So that I put you in a situation where you either have to let me cross a boundary or you have to say no, which feels rude to you. Or if I'm trying to like subtly imply that I need something without asking for it, you might be frustrated because you're like, I can't read your mind, right? I don't know what you want. Please just tell me.
Right.
And so while I'm not saying we should go out into the world and have everybody split into askers and inferrers and make T-shirts and have teams, it does help to know like maybe the problem in our communication is that I'm using this type of language and you're using that type of language, and how do we build a bridge?
I'm going to tie that into things both of you have said, which is, see if I can remember it all, working with people who are different than us help us grow. Mm-hmm. And we had talked about something in the break that was like the obstacles we overcome are the thing that define us. That's not the words you use, but that's what I heard in my brain. Yep. The obstacles that we overcome are what define us, not the things we get easily. So when we are inclined to these things, the disc profile, when we are inclined to the ways that we know how we operate, when we are inclined to be an asker, I think we grow the most where we kind of abandon the thing that we are good at, or at least not rely on it so much, and try to explore a reliance on these other traits that we are maybe not so good at, So if you're a good feeler, maybe don't rely on that so much just so you can try to expand the other things. If you're a good data person, don't rely on those things, right? Whatever it is that you feel the most comfortable in, I feel like it's almost it's too hard to grow as a human from that position, right? Because you're doing what's kind of easy. You're not challenging. You're not overcoming anything to just be the I that you are, the D that you are, the S that you are. But when you're like, I'm usually great at the S, but I'm gonna try I right now, which is not where I'm comfortable. You find more about yourself and you find more about the people around you, and you can grow and change. And so I think identifying that, hey, I'm an asker, but also realizing that maybe I need to step out of that to try to be better than just an asker is like really important for us as people.
So I have two things that I would love to learn from the three of you about. The first one is, I guess, kind of like a statement. I just want to see if where we all land. But do the three of you think that it's possible to grow without discomfort?
I don't think so.
I think that no, because there's always going to be some level of discomfort at some point.
So doesn't that kind of infer that if one of the things that we want to do about being human is that we want to grow, that we have to completely change our relationship with the way that we think about discomfort? That discomfort is the primary tool to be able to allow us to be able to become who we have the potential of becoming. And right now, one of the things somebody said earlier, but our relationship with easy has started to change because technology does have the ability to make things easier. And if you look at the way that, I think a good example of this that might be interesting for us is that if you look at the difference in generations, one of the things that you can see is that anybody who has grown up in sort of a digital world, boredom doesn't really exist. Because anytime you get bored, you're like, bam, like everything is right there. Holy
the summation
shit.
Of human knowledge
exactly,
is now in
like,
my hand.
Right there. Oh my God. But when you were a kid and you were bored, like I remember sitting on the steps, like going down in my basement, just being like, I have nothing to do. What am I? And then all of a sudden that would tweak something where I'd go down in the basement and I'd start like messing around with something, or I'd go walk over to a friend's house and knock on their door and beg them to come out and play or whatever it was. But that boredom created it created a moment where I needed to grow. Mm-hmm. And I think that relationship between discomfort and growth is something that maybe we can learn how to celebrate. I don't know exactly how to, but it feels like it might be an important part of how we re-identify ourselves.
When I was a little kid, I used to spend a lot of time outside just watching ants, which I imagine a lot of kids don't have the time for anymore. But I definitely, I remember having those moments when I was little of being like, there's nothing to do. I'm just going to go outside and see what happens if I sprinkle goldfish on the driveway.
Experiment.
And then I would watch, for hours and hours,
Yeah,
like,
that's
these
awesome.
ants are moving this thing. And then you start thinking about, it builds empathy. It builds like a desire to I want to understand this thing in front of me. I'm going to sit with it for a long time instead of just flipping through all kinds of random things.
I think it ties in with failure too. Like it's not just discomfort. I mean, failure, I guess, is a form of discomfort. But there's this fear of, as an educator, there's a real fear for students of failure. This real fear of I'm going to do poorly, and I don't remember that being. I mean, maybe it's who I was as a kid. I just don't remember being all that important to me if I messed up. There's always a chance to kind of recover, I guess. And for them, it feels like it's like the end of the world if they fail at something, And I my own kid, I try to not encourage that at all. That failing is an amazing opportunity, right? It means you tried something, It means you can learn from it, and I think that's why I think we need that discomfort in growth. Is you have to be able to reflect on something, and it's harder to seriously reflect on things that were super positive of an experience, right? It's hard to be like, well, let me think about what that caused. It's so positive, but when things suck, when things are really hurtful, when things are, not what you think they should come out like, it's I don't know, easier, but it's certainly easier to find the flaws. It's easier to look at what was wrong and start to analyze and reflect and hopefully grow from that. You don't want to just dwell on it, but
your brain is
recognize
inclined
it.
to be like, ooh, how do we rework this?
Something very, very fascinating. The word failure, right? You can fail, and that is the original meaning of the word. It's a verb, right? But at some point, and this is not a theory of mine, this is something I think I read in a book about Abraham Lincoln, which is another one of my little obsessions. But at some point around that time, failure became a noun, right? Like, you are not a person who has failed. You are a failure. That is what you are identifying as, which is a huge difference,
It is.
right?
Yeah.
Between having failed at something and being a failure.
Absolutely.
And it's so interesting how all of the different words that we use, we can get ourselves into real trouble by allowing a word to make some kind of transition like that. But even just it's so easy to have an argument with someone and realize that the only thing that you're actually arguing about is what a word means, and that you might agree on 100% of everything else in the entire world, but just you don't agree on what this word means. Like, Alex has probably heard me say this before, but classic question, right? If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it, does it make a sound? You could argue about that question for ages. You might not disagree about anything other than, does a sound mean vibrations that are physically traveling through the air, or does it mean a conscious observer that's encountered those vibrations and is sensing them, right? And there's so many different areas where you can get yourself into real trouble, like the Constitution. I'm not in a place to quote this exactly, but something like all men are created equal. They weren't careful enough with that. That word might to some people mean, oh yes, men, that's everyone, that's humanity. Whereas to other people, they interpret that as being male people. And to some people, they interpret that as being, male people from this certain region of the world. But it just that was a sort of a tangent on the original point of failure. But it's just interesting the way that words evolve and change, and the way that they can affect the way that you identify as a failure. And I think that no one wants to, like, we know it's okay to fail, but we don't want to be a failure. And so somehow we've got to try and make that clear that there's a difference.
It's almost like our podcast should have had 3 words to it. So it's thinking, and then language, and then intention. You know, because that feels like that's that missing piece, is that if the word failure means something in one way, and then someone comes along and they're like, ooh, if I can make you feel like a failure, how does that benefit me in some way? The intention of the word all of a sudden is now what changes. The word itself was never meant anything and will never mean anything beyond the interpretation that we give it. But the intention of the person who created the context for the word is really the so much of what goes into the language of that altogether. One of the things, 2 things, Oliver, our light for the Unscripted room went off, so I don't know if that's something that you have the controller
I did
anywhere.
not.
No big deal though.
I can fix that.
But the other thing that I was really curious for the 3 of us, or 4 of us, 3 of you specifically, is you had said earlier that you're not a big fan of labels.
Yeah.
And it struck me that as we're talking, that one of the things that's so powerful about labels and intention, or that language and intention, is where they meet at labeling. And I just thought that it would be a really fun discussion with 3 of you to understand, do we think labeling is helping us right now, or are we over-labeling everything, which is creating
It's
more...
reductive, right? And that has both positives and negatives, right? It's
Yeah.
reductive, so it does not give me the nuance or detail or the uniqueness of the thing I'm labeling and why it's slightly different than the other things that are similar in that label. But the world is complex and it's difficult to think about and talk about and communicate. And so labels allow us to reduce the thinking, to increase our ability to think bigger thoughts, because we're not having to discuss all of the individual nuances. That said, I think we have to just be clear as communicators that we are aware as communicators that that's what labels are doing for us, right? They are both making it easier for us to have really complicated conversations, but they're also leaving out some portion of the details that may be necessary in that conversation, but maybe they don't need to be at this level. It's just that when you get down to this level, 5 levels down, then you really do need to bring out all that nuance. But maybe when you're up at the top, it's better to have that reductive view.
And even as a whole, right? So in this room, I believe that we're going to have a really interesting conversation about labels, but there is way more labels for kids now than there was when I was a kid. I don't think that that's even... Does that feel debatable in any way? Like that there just seems like there's way more diagnoses that you
Yeah,
can
I think
get
it's
about
totally
anything
true.
today than you could have gotten before.
I would argue that for not just kids, but for anything. I mean,
Everything.
I tend to think of like something like sexuality has so many more words related to
Yeah.
it than when I was growing up, right? Just the variety of gender and sexual orientation alone. But I think that ties into that what we were saying earlier about emotions and having that palette of words to touch. So like those words, those labels, again, allow us to expand our understanding,
I think it does, but here's the other side that I think about sometimes with this, is that to me, the logical way to think about sexuality is that sexuality seems very, very clear to be a spectrum. You know what I mean? And on one side of the spectrum, you're into this one thing, and another side of the spectrum, you're into something else. And it seems like a very beautiful array of people who fall anywhere in between. And maybe it's not even a this side or that side. Maybe it's a perfect circle, and it all comes back together in some way. But in some ways, the more things that we try to pick out in that circle, the more that somebody has the ability to feel isolated, and they are a D, they are an I, they are a C, by making them feel like they've got to be a part of this label, rather than just being like, I'm me. And wherever I fall onto this, I'm just so grateful that I'm around people who are just going to allow me to be fully myself.
Yeah.
And how do we embrace each other as fully that?
I think it's also how you find the people in your community, though, right? That's, again, that reductive nature, having the double-edged sword.
Yes.
It allows me to easily find the other people who are,
Like-mind.
whatever the inclination I have is. Now, clearly, there's going to be nuance within that. Like, not everybody who's into like ethical non-monogamy has the same point of view of what that means, right? Sure. But you've now bucketed a bunch of people who the majority of them are going to fit into this one group. There's going to be outliers who don't. There's going to be people in the middle who agree a lot, but not entirely. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that they cannot also live on a spectrum of nuance? No, I think they absolutely can, and they do live on a spectrum of nuance, but it's like colors, right? We have the color wheel, has a million colors in it and a billion colors in it, but it's a lot easier for me to be able to say that's light pink. Yeah. Even though that like a slight shift in hue, it's really a different light pink. But it's just it's simpler for me for my communication.
I feel like I just learned something that wasn't dawning on me in the way that I was thinking about it, that you enlightened me to, which is the idea that it's also a mechanism for finding each other.
Sure.
And the more you feel, I would assume that the more you feel like whatever the thing is that makes you that feels really unique, that could either be a feeling of loneliness, or it could be a feeling of connection, and being able to have something where you can identify how to find each other has massive.
I will give you my lived experience version of that, because we grew up before the internet, not you, but the rest of us. And so I am out in like high school or middle school, and I like punk rock music, and so I am wearing mohawks and spikes and leather jackets, and I am showing other people this is the thing I'm into. Now, I was very lonely. In my high school, there was not a lot of people who were into what I would into. Mm-hmm. But you would go to a hardcore show or a punk rock show, and there's all these other people wearing that similar uniform. We may not actually like all the same bands. Like, we may have differences in the actual kind of punk rock, but the fact that we can have a conversation about the different kinds of punk rock makes us a community that I couldn't have when I was like the only person. So yeah, it isolated me at times, made me feel lonely. Mm-hmm. But when I was in other groups, I could be on a train, like on the T, on the Red Line, to a show and see someone wearing a shirt and go, same show, we're going to that same show, nice, that ability to kind of communicate that stuff was so powerful, at least in I don't know if it's as powerful today, because it's much easier to find niche communities with the internet, but for us it wasn't like that. There was you would have to talk to a million. If I dressed like a normal, like a normie, I would have to have talked to everybody in the world to find out what music do you like, what music do you like, what music do you like. But it was like, you have Mohawk, I bet we like some of the same music.
Good point.
I think part of a lot of what's happening now too is that a lot of these like languages of labels, whether it be something you identify as, whether it be a diagnosis, like they were originally created as a general identifier so you could pick out, and I was also picturing a color wheel, right, in terms of all these different ways that people can be. You can put it on a color wheel and say it's incredibly complicated, and then, before the internet, you would go out in the world and you would say, I'm trying to find somebody else who's blue so we can talk about the different kinds of blue there are. And now with the internet, we do definitely see this. People are able to connect, right? Like maybe you have someone who identifies as metaphorically cyan, and they never would have encountered another cyan person anywhere in their life if they were just walking. But now on the internet, they can find somebody else and they can connect. But it also means that we get these super narrow bands of connection where people then end up in an echo chamber where they're only ever talking to another person who is mahogany. Mm-hmm. And then they go out in the world and they're like, well, in my world, everybody is the mahogany shade of brown. And so I'm not even interested in trying to talk to somebody who's yellow, because I'm only interested in being in my super, super tight specific band. And so I think we're starting to forget a little bit that labels are a way to build a bridge and not a way to like identify and isolate yourself in this very rigid space.
It definitely has the potential to be able to connect, but it also clearly has the potential to make an us and them.
Yeah, totally. It's dividing.
And to me, I think maybe what I was trying to say, but I don't think that my thought of it was all that complex after I was listening to you, is that would we be better off just being able to be like, all I want you to be is you? In all the years that I've ever done training, right? The one thing that I know for absolute is that I never didn't like someone who was themselves. I didn't care who they were. I didn't care what any of that was. But if you could genuinely be yourself, I found that to be the most attractive version of a human that existed, was to be able to do that. But as soon as somebody started to put on an angle, or they started to put on something that you could tell they were trying to convince you that they were something that you weren't reading in your instincts or in your intuition, then it was like so much harder to find the space where I enjoyed being around that person.
Did you think they weren't being genuine?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that that's what it
And
was, yeah.
for you, I think, which is a great thing, I think you are of utmost integrity. Do you know what I mean? Like you want the authenticity of people. Like, and that's a good
Yes.
thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. But what I mean is, for you, like that's part of what you're looking at and what you're seeing. And when they're being inauthentic, that upsets you.
I think that it upsets me I hope that it doesn't upset me because it inflames my ego and that I am trying to operate
Yeah,
from
no,
there.
it's
And
not. It's
but,
just, yeah.
but where it does affect me is that I don't think that that person should be trusted on the same level as someone who is being honest with me.
Exactly.
Because I've had lots of circumstances in my life where I wanted to trust someone. So I did trust them, only to find out that my intuition was correct, that they were not being genuine with me. And the long-term effect of that was that I ended up being burned because I was naive. My intentions may not have been naive,
Right.
but the actions in which I allowed myself to be taken advantage of was because I chose to be naive rather than trusting my intuition.
Yeah.
And I used to feel bad, like, oh man, is it a good thing or a bad thing that you want to trust or not trust somebody? It's necessary. There are some people who you should trust and there are some people who you shouldn't trust. And, I happen to have learned a lot in my life through trauma, but I don't necessarily want my kids to learn through trauma. I would much rather them learn through being able to have a set of skills that they understand how to use to identify something that could become trauma, so that they can figure out how they can find a different pathway to being able to get to something that's healthier in their life. I don't think anybody's better off being traumatized. I think everybody is better off by moving towards things that are difficult, but not moving towards things that will traumatize them. I don't see any benefit to that, and I think we'd live in a much better world if we were able to collectively try to help each other avoid trauma.
I despise the phrase like it was good enough for us or we did that, right? It's like, yeah, but it doesn't mean it's good.
No,
like,
no.
Just because we survived it
No.
and like you are here still does not
Yeah.
mean that experience was a positive experience.
Talk
in
to
our life.
anybody who grew up. So my basic instinct when I talk to people is that most people either grew up in a soft household or a tough household, right? I happen to grow up in a soft household. I had two parents who loved us. And in particular, I had a very gentle father who kept, we felt safe when we were around him, but he never had an ounce of violence to him. Nobody even would have imagined that he would be violent towards anybody in our family. That's a privilege that I can't even completely understand. You know what I mean? Because if you've never lived in a house where you're constantly at fear of the other side of that, there's no way I could possibly understand what that is in my nervous system. There's no way that I could interpret what that does for your brain. But if you grow up in a household that is hard, you also are learning something about the way that the world really works, that the person living in a soft household is going to have no fucking clue when they step out into the real world. And so the difference between those two places, if I have to raise my kids, I'm raising my kids in a soft household. I want them to be raised in a place where they have unconditional love. That's what I want them to feel at all times. But I want to prepare them to understand that the world is a hard place. So I want them to understand how to do hard things before they go out into the world and figure it out on their own. That would be the gap that I would say in my own personal life. I'm not sure that my parents completely prepared me for. I think they prepared me to feel loved, but they didn't prepare me to understand how many people know how to take advantage of what innocence looks like and be able to use that to their to make them feel in control. Hurt people. So if you're out there in the world and you've had something happen to you, they're looking for innocence to go take that from. Maybe subconsciously, maybe it's not even a conscious thing that they're doing, but it certainly happens.
I think it is subconscious, and I think a lot of it comes from like whether or not you have a mindset of plenty or of not having plenty, right?
Yeah.
Like if I walk into a grocery store and I can't see what the grocery store has, but I'm pretty sure that there's enough for everyone. I'm just going to take what I need and I'm going to go. But if I walk into a grocery store and my understanding of the world is that there's going to be 3 apples and I see 7 people,
Right.
I know.
Toilet paper during COVID is a great
Right,
example.
like either
of this,
I
you know?
starve or I get rid of a couple of these guys, and that's not even a bad mindset, right? Like that's a great point, right? Like if there's only 3 apples and there's 7 people, I would teach my kids, take somebody out, get yourself an apple. And so you have people who are operating in the world under the assumption that there won't be enough for them unless they push other people out of the way. And when that's true, that's a totally clever, rational, emotionally balanced, like that's a good response. That's what you should do.
So can we play with that for a little bit? Just
Actually,
'cause-
can I say something
Yeah,
first? I'm
please.
sorry, no, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just
no.
want to go back to this. So it's interesting. We're so conditioned to label. It's just what we're conditioned to. And when you just said hurt people, it's labeling hurt people as they're going to hurt people, where a lot of people who have been through trauma as a child will grow up to be traumatic, to do trauma. But then there's this people that had that is the complete opposite. And they grow up to be the kind person to fight for the people.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And so this is just great because we are conditioned to label. And the majority of hurt, and actually it's not even the majority of hurt people. I don't know what it is, what the majority is or what the statistics are. But it's fascinating. It's like, how do we, it's almost like we have to unlearn everything we've learned, you know?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. But it's just our nature to do what we were taught. And what we were taught wasn't really correct. And this is where we're at now as a society of all it needs is awareness of it.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, you know?
I think what you heard from me was lazy language.
And that's
You know,
okay.
It is and it isn't, right? Especially in an episode about language.
No, but
It
that's
prob-
why this happened, I think, which is great to learn from it, you know?
So let's dig into that for
Yeah.
a second, though, because I
Okay.
think that it's, I want to be really accountable to my language because I believe that language really matters and that it's very, very important.
Yeah.
And I do think that, that it's people who have been hurt are definitely not guaranteed to go hurt other people if they have processed their hurt. But if they don't process their hurt, I have never seen an example of someone who has unprocessed trauma that does not then go and create reoccurring trauma for someone else. So it's the nuance between those two places that's really interesting to me because it's both true and not true because I was lazy with the language. But
I think
they,
the accuracy is actually to reverse the statement, right? People who hurt people, people who cause trauma for other people often experience trauma themselves, right? Or may have experienced trauma themselves.
it seems
So I
very
the
don't
unlikely.
think
receiver-
it's lazy language. I think
No,
it's
I don't
like
either.
it's a model, right? When you're trying to express the idea that, like, you know, if somebody's beating you up on the playground, we might want to take a minute and think about where that behavior came from, and like in that way, it's a great model for that idea. It's really concise. It's really tight. But then we do end up stuck in these patterns of not analyzing the ways and the situations in which the model fails us. And I cut you off.
No, not at all. No.
It's all very complex. That's the thing
It
is that you
is.
to say
There's so
this
many
is and this
layers.
is why I would hold myself accountable to saying that it's lazy language is because the complexity of someone feeling hurt is very deep. And the complexity of someone feeling hurt and deciding that they need to gain control by hurting someone else is very, very deep. So having a saying that's very quick and easy doesn't get to any of the complexity that is buried underneath that. And I think that that's exactly how the world gets better is that we stop pretending like anything is simple. Everything is complex. Everything is nuanced and everything takes so much curiosity and understanding to try to figure out how we get to the other side of it. And then we also have to not allow ourselves to pretend like if someone has dealt with a trauma that it doesn't make them more likely to then go and if they don't process it to then perpetrate trauma on someone else. It's actually a great opportunity for us to understand that if we can find that and we can figure out how to support that person, that the chances of that being perpetuated in the future goes down significantly. So we've got to look at both sides, right? Like we've got to be able to find the balance of not pretending like everything is okay when it's not, but we also have to figure out how we don't overlabel something that is intensely complex to the degree that making an assumption will never work. You know, only questions will ever work to get to the depth.
I think we have to remember also that, we're approaching truth, right? And we can never really, we're like literally approaching truth in a mathematical sense. We're never going to get there.
Like a limit.
Like a limit, exactly. We're never going to hit it. So we need to understand that like this way of thinking approaches truth from this side, but I'm not going to reach perfect truth because I'm human and I have a bias. So I have to be able to also look at it from this side and see how close I can get from that side.
Yeah.
And remembering that like every statement comes with context and bias and a human perspective.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of anything that you think is absolutely true?
No.
I think therefore I am, but that's kind of a cop out.
Well, and like at least in
Well,
science perspective,
yeah.
we have things that are called laws, like the law of gravity. It does not
Mm-hmm. just
imply,
gonna
it
say
does not try to explain what gravity is. It just says, I will lift this thing and it will fall.
Sure.
And we can like all experientially agree with that.
Yes.
The why that happens is where you get into like the scientific method and what a theory is versus a hypothesis. And in science, we call a theory like the best truth we can come up to with the evidence that we've been given, right? That does not mean it is true. It just means that with what we've seen, this is the best we can come to. It doesn't necessarily make it fact. It just makes it as close to a fact as we can get. But the law of gravity, I would argue, is like an experiential fact. Everyone can agree with it. We can hold two magnets together and we can feel them repel. Why? That's where you start getting into like this question of what is truth. But I think some things, that said, we're all watching this bottle cap drop, and all of us are experiencing that uniquely with our own eyes and our own brain, and perhaps we are not finding some kind of common experience there. But, I think that's the closest we have maybe is like I said, like scientific law, not a theory, not a hypothesis, but like the things we are not trying to explain, but the things we observe.
But for you as a individual consciousness, just someone who is experiencing your own life, has experienced things that we've never experienced, right?
I mean, I can find my own truth, I think.
Yes. Do you have anything that you rely on as being this sort of like central piece of you that you find to be a truth that guides you that we could also figure out whether we relate to in some way?
That's a really tough question.
Yeah, it is a tough one.
I do think that, like I said earlier, I have like a set of principles that I'm a principled person. You seem to jive with that pretty well. Like I have a set of ideas that I think are true for me, that they are true ways to live, and I try to adhere to those. I'm trying to think of like a good one that's simple to talk about, but nothing's simple to talk about, as we were just talking about.
I'll give you one if it helps spark
Sure,
anything, right?
yeah.
So for
Yeah,
me,
go for it.
if I had one that I thought, if I had one thing that I thought was true, it would be that the way I do anything is the way I do everything. And for me, that one phrase changed my whole life. And I've told Oliver this. I don't know. I told Oliver this one time when we weren't on, but the way that even came into my life is when I think I was probably in middle school. I was babysitting for a family that I had an enormous crush on the mom that I was babysitting for. And when I got to their house, I ate something that made me feel very uncomfortable, that I knew that I was going to have to use their restroom. And it fucking freaked me out that I had to use the restroom at this house with this woman who I thought was like, Jackie O or whatever was in my middle school head of the experience that I was having. And so I go into the bathroom, and I think that what was happening was that my senses were on 10 because I was thinking about what an embarrassment this was, that everyone was going to know that I was there for longer than I should have been, which was going to mean that everybody, when I walked back into the room, was going to know exactly what I had just done, while I was gone. And while I was sitting there, I looked up, and up on the wall, knitted, those kinds of like knitted sayings.
Yeah.
It said, "The way I do anything is the way I do everything." And the intensity of that moment imprinted that in my brain so much that I don't remember ever seeing that phrase again, but years later, when I was probably in my 30s and had gone through something and I was trying to be reflective on my life, that popped back into my consciousness. And then it completely realigned myself to this idea that I I can't be one version of myself at home, and I can't be one version of myself when I'm at work, and I can't be another version of myself somewhere else. It's just me. Everywhere I go, it's just me, and I don't have permission to try to pretend like I can compartmentalize me. I have to make sure that I go everywhere, and that means I have to take absolute accountability for where I am and who I am at any given time. And I'm like, I think that means that it might be true. Maybe it's just true for me, but it also allowed me to see that if I pay attention to that exact same trait in everybody else, it really helped me figure out, if I could see you do anything, I kind of know how you're about to do everything. And it ended up being pretty universally true when I started applying it to other people too, that it wasn't absolutely true, but man, it was pretty goddamn consistent rule that I could use to start figuring that stuff out. I'm just wondering if anybody else has those kinds of things that have guided you in
Got a
really
little
interesting
reminder
ways.
that I'll say. I have one. It's from a really dumb book that I found on a Greyhound bus once when I was driving across traveling across the country.
Perfect.
And it just had one. And at once the page had one sentence, and it just said, "Beware means be aware." And it was this moment I read that really
Love
blew
that.
my mind. It feels dumb sometimes, but it was like so pivotal in my mind.
That's hitting.
Because it just made me realize that like when to beware does not mean be afraid of this thing,
Yes.
right? When it says beware of dog, it does not mean watch out, oh my God, this dog's gonna kill you. It's like close the gate behind you because there is a dog in this yard, right? It does not have to mean this negative connotation that we put on it so much. Just be aware and pay attention. And it encourages me to, like, it reminds me to reflect a lot more. And we were talking about reflecting earlier. It reminds me to reflect a lot more, that like be aware. And even with the labels that we were talking about, right? You had said that the key is awareness.
Yeah.
I think it's fine to use a label to say like hurt people, but I think the people listening and you speaking all have to be aware that you are reductive. It is something that is not meant to tell the whole story. Right?
Right.
It's meant to be a soundbite to sell an idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also an opportunity for me to grow, because I
Sure.
might have meant it as something that was
Absolutely.
more literal, but you being able to come back and be able to share that right away causes me to have to be able to reflect on it. I was even, when you were saying it, was even trying to think like, oh man, is this making me feel defensive?
Yeah.
Should I be defensive? Should I
Yeah.
not be defensive? And then usually what that makes me go into is just, okay, let's just go down the rabbit hole together and let's figure out, if I am doing this, let's go through. But there are parts of this that feel true to me still. You know, it's that
I've got a couple
nuance.
things. So first of all, the be aware thing is really interesting, because I think one of the things that, and usually I will say this, I usually don't interject this much when we're doing podcasts, but I can't keep it to
I like
myself
it.
back here. The way that like language, the words that we use they really are a direct result of history, and so things get combined in all sorts of interesting ways, which I just think is a fascinating thing to point out in terms of in light of the theme of language and thinking. And then I've got this other thing that I just thought was great about emergent levels of complexity with language that I just wanted to share with you guys. This is fantastic. Ready? So I did a little experiment where I took a really simple sentence, like bottle of water was coming up a lot, right? In several examples. So you could say, could you pass me that bottle of water? Or if you were to just take a couple of those words and just peer into some of the complexity behind them, the kinds of things that you would be learning about, what these words mean when you're a baby, right? You probably, by the time you're 5, you know what bottle and water mean, but you've internalized a lot of information. And where you could say, could you pass me that bottle of water? You could instead replace bottle and water with their Oxford definitions and get a sentence much like this. Could you please pass me that narrow-necked, typically handleless container made of glass, plastic, or metal used to store or carry or dispense liquids and powders of an essential naturally occurring chemical compound composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atoms? And I just thought that was really funny.
Well, I think it's a good point too
It
about
is.
how like language is reductive.
Yeah.
Every word that we use
Yes.
is a model for a real truth that cannot be like fully portrayed in language. It's almost like, a lot of sci-fi novels like to play with the idea that there's an extra dimension that we can't see. So we have to kind of interpret the world just in the dimensions that we have access to. Language kind of feels like, okay, I'm taking a slice of truth, I'm approaching a truth in a way that can be conveyed.
Yeah.
But it's not, like we're assuming that the people we talk to have their definitions of bottle and their definition of water in their heads, and they know that we're being reductive in order to not have a simple interaction take a 20-minute conversation.
Yeah. It is. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it's I don't know, it feels like there's something in this where it's like we need to figure out how to give each other permission to be able to see language as an opportunity to share, but make sure that we don't use language as a way to define. That the human is so much more complex than the language is ever going
Totally.
to allow us to be able to understand.
And that's why we never really know what the other's thought behind what they're saying actually is. Do you know what I mean? And we only know from the lens we're receiving it as.
Yes.
And when we can understand the inner work of figuring out your lens on the triggers from our upbringing, from our nurture, from our experiences, especially before we're 7 years old, it's that's when the real healing happens. Yeah, it's hard for me to explain.
No.
But,
I'd
have you ever heard of Success by Six? You might have. Have you heard of that?
I haven't heard that
premise of it-
specific phrase, but it's
Okay.
tied to ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences.
It could be, yeah. So what it basically is the brain. When we're first born until we turn 7, it's growing and adapting and learning, and we're processing every single thing into, I like that, I'm putting it in my like box. I didn't like that, I'm putting it in my didn't like box. When we turn 7, the brain is now shifting where we're really kind of assessing everything more than we ever did before, and the things we don't like, we're starting to be like, ooh, I don't want that, or I don't like that. We're starting to try to control our surroundings so that we feel comfortable and safe. And it's fascinating. That's the lens we see the rest of our life through. And everyone's experience was unique. And we don't really ever know what another went through or what they're triggered by.
Also,
So
don't
I-
remember it in ourselves,
Yeah.
which is really wild.
It's
to think
fascinating.
about.
Right, because you can't
So
even
when
draw
we're
it out
saying
to reflect on
something
Yeah.
to someone in a conversation, we know what we mean by what we're saying. If the other person is receiving it and it's a negative for them, and they're not letting the person who's talking with them know that, then they're just perceiving things completely different from what we wanted to articulate. And it causes a lot of confusion, and even in the relationship, and once we can look at our own self and look at the things that are triggering us and be comfortable being vulnerable and being able to express to another person what we aren't understanding, then relationships get so much better and the communication is good. But if we don't have the ability to let someone know that we're put off by something or we didn't like this, it causes all of the problems in relationships, no matter what relationship it is, a sibling, a wife or a girlfriend or anything, coworker, all of it. If we can't feel comfortable expressing how we truly feel about something, then we're limiting growth on both people.
Everything that you were just saying, the idea that most of our emotional imprinting comes from conception to 7 years old. I one time had an experience where I was doing some training at a dealership in New Jersey, and I ran into a gentleman who had spent the majority of his life growing up in the Middle East and had just come to the United States and was being integrated into a sales team, and we went through the training, but it was like a half a day of training, and then I just had a half a day where I was kind of hanging out with the staff and getting to know them, and we sat down and we started having a very intimate conversation about parenting. And I think it was at a time in my life when I was in my early 30s. I went through a divorce with my kid's mom, and it was difficult. And And so I think I was pretty raw from what that was. And this guy was very compassionate to me and very kind. And we went off to some place that had nothing to do with work, and we were just talking. And he said that where he was coming from his culture in the Middle East, that they have this very distinct pattern that they use for parenting that he found to be very helpful, which was that they believed that from conception to 7 years old was the most important time in a child's life. And so that the number one thing that you focus on as a parent is that you make unconditional love the primary focus of all things from 0 to 7. Then from 7 to 14 is where discipline comes in. And he said, it's from 7 to 14, you have to no longer be their friend, and you have to make sure that you apply discipline so that they understand without a shadow of a doubt the difference between what is right and what is wrong. And then from 14 to 21, you need to figure out how to become a guide, and you need to stop trying to control them anymore, and you need to figure out how you allow them to come into their own sense of self, but still make sure that they understand that you're there when they need you, but you are no longer trying to do it. And I was like, Then I started looking into what scientific studies were there to be able to back up this conception to 7, and it was like every fucking study said the same thing. Then I started thinking, well, why do we do nothing to protect children from 0 to 7? What is going on in this world right now? And every time somebody tried to compel me to be on this side or that side, I'm like, does either one of those sides do something to hurt children from 0 to 7? And the answer is almost always yes. And I'm like, well, then I don't have a side to be on. I'm homeless. I don't know where to go, because this is the most obvious thing that the world has right now, is that we should protect children. And there's a lot of children who are in bad situations. So what do we do about that? Like, what do we all do about that? Because it doesn't seem right. And yet, if you conduct yourself in any normal affairs in the world, you know that it's happening all the time. It's a very difficult thing to be able to come to terms with, because it's so big once you let it in, and it's so, it hurts your heart so much.
Supporting parents is the problem that we, at least in this country, don't do, right? We don't, when we don't have good maternity leave policies. We don't have well-funded pre-K or preschool education. I mean, there's a wonderful study. I don't know. I have not kept up with it on the details, but about 10 years ago, it had been about 35 or 40 years in act. It's called the Perry Preschool Project. And they went to Detroit. They took a bunch of kids who weren't going to go to preschool, and they put half of them in preschool for 6 months and the other half not in preschool for 6 months, and then followed them for the rest of their life. And you'd think, oh, the preschool kids, maybe they went to college or something. Not even the data you would expect. It was like kids who went to preschool were less likely to have had an encounter with the police in the past week, were more likely to have money in a bank account, were more likely to own a car. Like, all these things that don't seem related were all like the only difference that, you know, this experiment was really looking at was, what does the 6 months of preschool do? And it turned out that over the rest of their lives, the people who had 6 months of preschool did significantly better, right? So protecting and nurturing these young kids, right? Whether it's a, you know, preschool, or whether it's an opportunity to do that same kind of learning and socializing, being able to fund parents and children to engage in doing that protection from 0 to 6, 0 to 7 is, I think, the thing we are missing, at least in our society here. You know, I valued so much as my job allowed me to be home after school when my kid got home for every day of school she's ever been in it. And I have summers off, so I got to spend a lot of time with her in those early years. But she was born in the summer, so I had like a long maternity leave for that, paternity leave for that. And I think that's some of the best choices we made raising a kid was making sure that she was, you know, the best opportunities that were afforded to her in those first like 6 or 7 years that we could, you know, most love, the most whatever it was. You know.
Those statistics are what I was thinking about when I heard, I forget exactly what the phrase was that you used.
Success by 6. It means through by the time you finish being 6. So by the time you turn 7, the brain is just shifting into another form of relating to things.
Right, and when you hear like phrases like this, it's a succinct way of trying to say like we need to support kids who are young. But it can also be twisted, because it's a reduction, into this very negative thinking about people who had a negative childhood. I mean, you don't want to tell an adult, oh, success by 6 looks like you didn't get what you needed.
Yeah, but the thing is, and I agree with you. I totally agree with you. It's more about every single experience that
Yeah.
the child has
Gets filtered through.
gets filtered into being their nurture. And we mean we've all had some hard things. Some people have terrible things. Some people have, not much bad, which is great. But even so, it's more about how it forms the individual psyche. And things that we get triggered by all stem from our upbringing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the parents did something bad or whatever. Like identical twins, they're born on the same day. They have the same numerology. They are in the same family at the same time. But one went to an aunt's house for a week while the other one went somewhere else when they were 4. And it shifted their mind to be different, And so it's more about the reactions we have and the triggers. When we can look at what is really happening with that to heal our own reactions to things or to understand. Not necessarily heal, but understand our reactions. That's when communication can get so much better.
Can I bring up
Yeah.
the flip side to this that I think would be really good for us to be able to talk about? Because there's so much going on in the world that we want to do, but the other reality is that if the 4 of us, 5 of us, Oliver, as a part of this as well, if we're happy with who we are right now, if we love ourselves right now in this moment, then it also, based on what you just said, means that you mathematically cannot be upset with anything that happened to you up until this point right now, because every single thing that happened to you is part of the texture that allowed you to become exactly who you are sitting in this moment. So I think it's really important that we also talk about the idea that I feel like there's been a principle in psychology that I feel from the work that I've done really comes a lot from the Freudian sort of interpretation of what psychology is, that people are broken and that they have to try to put themselves back together in some way. What feels much more honest to being myself is that I feel like maybe I was born and blessed to be born into a body and into a mind and into a consciousness. And what I have to do is figure out how I remove as many things that are creating an identity that don't allow me to prevent me from just absolutely being myself at any given time. But that's different than feeling like I'm broken and that I have to try to repair something and put it back together. But if the difference between those two places is, if you think that you're dealing with something that has a fundamental flaw versus dealing with something that you just realize that you have to do a simple diagnosis to get, operating at a higher level, those are two different strategies that you take to the way that you're trying to overcome whatever that challenge is. And maybe something as simple as that in our language makes a big difference in the way that we can realize that no matter where you start, the end is self-love.
Totally.
The end is figuring out how you can be okay with being yourself in the moment right now.
I love the idea of loving who I am right now. I always say, I love who I am right now, so I have no regrets for any other part of my life.
Yeah.
I think you can still be angry about them, you can be sad about them, you can have feelings about them, but I can't regret them, even if I think they were bad choices or if I think they were bad experiences. When I think about them, they still formed the person I am happy with, right? And that's hard to, I think, accept for a lot of people, that that tough pathway, if you like where you are. If you don't like where you are, it's a harder, different place. But if you like where you are, if you like who you are, then everything had to have happened just how it happened. And the idea that if I could only go back and make this one change, my life would be better. It's like, you can't know anything like that. If you made that one change, you could be a completely different person.
Yeah.
You might not even be in this current situation anymore. You might be in a totally different place because you're not, you did this one thing different. That's all it takes.
But most of the time when people get to the point where they've really accepted themselves, it's because they did a lot of work to go back and figure out where were they feeling things that were making them not get to that point. And it takes a lot of reflection, and it takes a lot of being angry and offering forgiveness to yourself and offering, there's this primary thing that's so complicated about all human beings is that I don't know anybody that's going to get through life without being victimized at some point.
Totally.
So we've got to figure out how we validate people for being victimized, but we also give them permission to not live as a victim. because I've never met anybody who did well when they lived in a victimhood behavior. So that is a very complex thing, because you can't force the idea of asking somebody to not live as a victim. That's their choice. They've got to make that choice on their own, but there should be some way that we can encourage each other to all have that shared experience. That, listen, we need to love on each other when somebody's gone through something tough, but then we also need to make sure that they agree that staying in a tough place does not help you get to a better place. You know what I mean? If you're, you've got to figure out where forward momentum starts, and then how do you use that so that you actually get to a place where you're really glad that you came to that destination. And the destination, we deceive ourselves in thinking that it's like an amount of money or a role that you're going to have. It's just you. It's just whoever you become and whatever that is. And for some people, that is having very little. For some people, that's having a lot. But I think that's why it's so important that we focus on equality of opportunity, and we completely let go of equality of outcome. We'll never, as long as we are arguing about equality of outcome, we will always argue. But if we focused on equality of opportunity, could we give every kid the same chance? Preschool seems like it scientifically works out that if you give everybody the same chance when you're young, that seems to turn out that more of those young people end up doing well. Why don't we stop building bombs and start building preschools? Like, that
Wouldn't
seems
even cost
possible.
that many bombs. We wouldn't have to stop.
Yeah.
Just reduce it a little bit.
One few.
But not a crazy idea, right?
I once had a fellow professor ask me one time, what do you think is the most important thing for success in a student? Do you think it is intelligence, motivation, and opportunity? And without any hesitation at all, my answer was opportunity. And he did not agree. He said, no, motivation. You can motivate yourself to opportunity. And I said, that could be true. There are some people who are going to be really motivated, and if you're in the right place, if you're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you're really motivated, you'll probably discover some opportunities. But if you're in rural Africa, and the no one around you is doing anything except just living their life in their little area, and I know Africa is a complex nation and a complex continent, and I'm not trying to reduce it to one idea, but just saying if you're in a place that is even rural Appalachian Mountains, right? The opportunities are so narrow. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how motivated you are. If you are stuck on the top of a mountain, with no opportunity, there's no chance for that forward momentum, for that student success. Certainly, the more of those other traits you have, the more successful you will be. But it's opportunity is the thing that evens the playing field.
Oliver and I the other day were in an art gallery having a conversation with a photographer, and he was a great guy. He was telling us about his different art. He was encouraging us to make art and to share art. He was saying, if you're passionate about something, you will find a way. I didn't ever think I was going to have a gallery, this man said, but I just chased my passion, and one day I was in this gallery getting my photo printed, and they offered me to have my own running set of pieces in the gallery. And I'm like, that is related to curiosity, and it is related to following your passion, but it's also related to being the type of person who can afford to have your photo printed. Right? Yeah. There's plenty of people who are passionate about photography who cannot afford to have their photos printed, and for that reason alone would never have walked into the print shop and would never have been offered a gallery. And I think that it's so easy for us to forget, right, when we're thinking about, wasn't it a crazy coincidence that somebody offered me a gallery based on my decision to go get my photo printed, that we forget about all the little mini decisions that put somebody in a position where they had the time and the money to get their photography printed out and to meet people in the community who were able to boost them up. And that's what people who are really raw about motivation forget.
Yeah. I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps, but you got to have boots.
Yeah, you got, or people who say, we all have the same 24 hours in a day. It's like, that's bullshit.
Yeah, not if you're doing my laundry for
That's
me.
bullshit.
Not if you're cooking for me.
We all sleep, and we all have to acquire food, and some people have to cook it, and some people have to cook it on an insanely low budget, so they have to strategize, and they have to go to the grocery store.
Can you afford to Instacart, or are you going to 3 different grocery stores on a Sunday with the flyers trying to get the best discounts you can? Those are huge different time sinks.
Yeah.
Can I share something that feels very vulnerable to talk about in a group, especially with people that we didn't know each other before tonight? Yeah. I feel like so much of my life, that exactly what you're saying has been something that I've been exploring my entire life to try to figure out, what can we do to figure out the boots and the bootstraps and the, you came from privilege, you don't have privilege, you have this, you don't have that. And what I found was that I couldn't figure it out. Couldn't figure out that there is a solution to any of that, which makes me feel like what I don't want to do is I don't want to assume that because someone has less, that they're not capable of being able to find their interest in gaining more, and that has nothing to do with me. It's so hard to just try to be the best version of myself every day, to just wake up every day and just keep myself accountable to my own bullshit, that I have such a hard time figuring out how I could possibly judge anybody else, good or bad, for whether they're doing stuff. But I just found I grew up extremely liberal my whole life, and still find myself to be. I've not lost an ounce of compassion for the world, but I also have found myself in certain circumstances where I have found liberal ideas that I thought were for the betterment of people to actually just be another form of judging somebody to not be able to perform something that they might have somewhere in them because I gave them an excuse that they couldn't.
One word that I think often gets misconstrued is equity. I'm a huge fan of equity. I, in school, studied economics, and then in my working life, have done a lot of social work. And equity means, in the way that it's defined, in the way that we're hoping people will use it, equality of opportunity, right? Like, you have a classroom full of kids, every single one of them has access to half an hour of homework help every night. That would be trying to work towards equity. And I have a friend, a very good friend, who is a teacher in Portland. She teaches algebra to freshmen in Portland. And she told me once that she has a philosophy that if a kid is really struggling, she will try to help them and provide what I would define as equity by giving them as much extra time outside of class as they need. But she's not going to pass a kid who doesn't know what they're doing, because that would be a disservice to a kid. Even if the kid is failing because the kid is working an extra job to support their family, if she passes them out of high school algebra and they don't know algebra, that's a disservice to them, right? And so I think we really need to think about, we want people to still be able to push themselves to achieve real things and actually be able to learn. And then at the same time, we need to hold the fact that some kids go home to a parent who passed high school algebra 30 years ago and still remembers it and can sit for 2 hours every night and do homework. And some kids go home to a parent who can't read any of the word problems because they're not in the language the parent speaks and doesn't have a big math background. And we need to be able to both hold those two kids accountable to the same standard, but provide one more support because the other one is getting that support for free at home.
There's a like a classic cartoon of this. Like the in education we talk a lot about the equity versus equality, right? So equality is everyone gets the image is like four kids of different heights standing at a fence wanting to watch a baseball game. Like one is more than tall enough, one is like the two in the middle, and one is short, and they all get given one like apple box to stand on, right? The tall kid doesn't need it, but he's standing on it anyways, right? It's not super helpful for the short kid because he's still too short, right? So that's equity. That's everybody gets one apple box. That's equality. Equity is that the tall kid doesn't need an apple box. He's fine. The short kid needs two apple boxes, and the two kids in the middle just need one apple box, right? And so this idea that we can distribute things equally, but it's not equitably, is a big thing in like current education. Well, not really since Trump took over and they got rid of DEI bullshit, but prior to that, there was a big conversation we had a lot. Was how do you move from a mindset of equality to a mindset of equity, right? So like how do you give people not just the same opportunity, but equal chances at being successful within that opportunity? I think.
So I think that all of that makes total sense to me, and I love this conversation, and I love that we're having this conversation. But like the thing that sometimes get missed in this is like, does the system that we built focus on making sure that there's stepping stones in which everybody's going through to make sure that the homework that you're taking home with you is equal opportunity for everybody? You know what I mean? Because I don't know that we can. like once you start moving, like, okay, you're tall, you don't need a box. Okay, so now that person's like, but like, why don't I, you know what I mean? And it creates this feeling that everybody now feels like if you're the tall person that had a box that went over to the short person, am I now up against the short person because I had to give this away? And I think what we need to start is, what could we recreate that allows everybody to be able to start from a deeper foundation, from something that wasn't like you can do math or you can't do math? Is there something that everybody could be like? I think the best part of our conversation that we've had tonight is when we are all saying, we all agree that what we really want to focus on is to allow everybody to be themselves. And why is it more important that we educate everybody to be able to know something than it is that we educate everybody or give everybody the opportunity to be able to be them?
It's so true.
Because there is
I mean,
nothing
the thing
in there.
is, like, is it even feasible to have things be equitable?
No.
How can it be
but
when
it's
they're going
just
home?
like
No, but what I mean is,
Yeah, but it's a principle that you adhere to,
it
that you
isn't.
strive for, right?
Even though we could try, and we want them all to have the same thing, but they're all coming from different ways, different situations, so they're not equal. And are they supposed to be equal? Or is the individuality of each person's situation unique, and that's the way it's supposed to be? I have no answers to this. I'm just talking out loud.
This is why I really love the way that my friend who's a high school teacher put it. I love the way that she talks about it. She says, there is a standard, right? You cannot pass high school algebra if you do not understand the algebra, right? Like, there's a standard. We want everyone to meet it. We don't want to pass kids who can't do it because they won't be ready to hit the hard world, right? They won't know how to do algebra. But at the same time as we're holding a standard, we also need to remember that different kids are getting support in different places. And so if you identify that some of your kids are never getting any help with homework, you want to be able to have extra time for those kids to get support, whether it's like an extra tutor, and then you got to figure out, okay, can this kid afford a tutor? No, we want to help them in that way. So you have to hold at the same time. We want everybody to be above the fence, right? We want everybody to meet a standard that's real and that matters. And at the same time, we're thinking about what are the different support needs of different people in different spaces.
I think that the analogy of the fence is really interesting because whose fence? And who created the ball game that they're watching on the other end, and why doesn't the kid who's standing on the apple box, why is it their fence or is it their game? Because those things really matter to me, because the person who created the fence might have an agenda of why those apple boxes were there, and they might benefit from moving one apple box to another place for another person.
Sure.
All of that
I think-
is there's opportunity for equity. But it also, if you look at it carefully, is tremendous opportunity for manipulation. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't strive for one. I'm just saying we can't be ignorant to the other, because there are people out there who want us to be ignorant to that. And they have been using it for years and years and years to be able to
So the
create
reason I
something.
think why we were both kind of laughing at that is because there's a third graphic that nobody ever talks about.
Okay, I like
Where
that.
they cut the legs off the tall kid. No.
So that's a little bit too French. No, there's a third graphic, right? There's the equality graphic where everyone gets the same thing. There's the equity graphic where we look at who needs what and we give different boxes depending on, what different people need to reach the same standard. And then the third graphic, they just take the fence away and it's called liberation. And that's the ideal.
Well, so like if we take algebra, for example, right? My kids, I feel very fortunate that my kids are extremely intelligent young men. I stopped being able to help them with their math homework probably around 4th or 5th grade. If you put algebra in front of me right now, it would be such a foreign language to me. And yet I feel like I have been able to be a level of successful in my life that makes me feel really proud of who I am. And so algebra didn't mean shit to me.
I would
It
argue
never
use-
meant
Why are we
anything
even
to me.
I would
learning
argue
it?
you use algebraic thinking constantly. In fact, every day you use algebraic thinking. You just don't write down equations.
Okay, so that might be true, and I would love to have that discussion, because I'm not trying to.
Well, yeah. How many water bottles did you need to put in this room? You wanted 2 water bottles per person, and there are 4 people in this room. Therefore, you just did algebra.
Yes. Okay.
2 times W equals 8. What's W?
So no denying the fact that that the mathematical equations that are happening all the time are a beautiful part of the math and the fabric of what's happening.
They're just a way to communicate the ideas.
Exactly. But my thought was more that we put this onus on this idea that because something's important to us, that it is important to all. And the idea that that for somebody who maybe doesn't have a brain where mathematics is the way that they interpret that language to be able to understand something complex and important, that we need them to be able to finish that before they can go on and feel like they're ready to be a successful person in the world. That might be something we want to examine.
I would argue it has much more to do with how we teach and present mathematics than how your brain works and what we focus on. Because you use mathematical and logical thinking constantly in life. Everyone does. You wouldn't be able to get through life if you didn't. Every transaction you had at a store would end up in failure. We are constantly using these things. We present them terribly because the goals of school and education often are not aligned to actually educate people, right? They're meant to create a common experience. Is what the Prussians came
I
up
think
with.
also, though, there is this point about different types of people excelling in different areas, and we are currently living in a world where you need to. I mean, part of the reason why you need to be able to understand different topics that we teach in school is so that you can function in society. And the reason why you need to be able to function in society is because if you can't function, you're going to starve. And so I think one example of a way that we could strive towards the liberation graphic would be to say, okay, so we're actually not going to condemn anybody to starve, even if they don't have the skills to hold down a job, right? And then you sort of take away this fence of either you succeed in maintaining yourself financially or you don't get over the fence and nobody's going to help you and you're going to have to scrabble and figure something out. And so I think there is sort of validity to both sides of saying we, in an ideal world that we may never achieve, want to think about the fact that the reason why everybody needs to do these things is because they won't be safe if they can't do them.
Yeah.
But we don't want, I don't want anyone to feel truly unsafe just because they're not very good at a certain skill. So how do we build a world in which you can focus on the skills that matter to you without having to worry about starving to death?
Well, what I was thinking as you were saying it is this almost goes back to what Lisa was saying earlier, where it's like, well, mathematics is very, very important for all the reasons that you were saying. And I got to be honest, I wish I could have taken a math class from you because I think maybe I would have a totally different relationship with math because you're an amazing teacher and you probably would have taught it to me in a way that would have brought in what I think is the real key component to learning, which is interest. I've never met anybody who learned anything to the point where they were striving some level of mastery unless they were interested. And I think probably the quickest pathway to interest is play.
Absolutely.
And to feel like you can engage in something that is you're not doing it because somebody is making you do it. You're doing it because someone is encouraging you to love to do it. But I'm not saying I have a lot of curiosity for why we value certain forms of history and math and the kinds of things that I've watched my children go through in school, but I've never had them go through a course in school where anybody asked them to evaluate the difference between their feelings and their thoughts, and how their nervous system was being affected by these two things. And I've never seen anything where there was a collective consciousness for trying to teach kids about how to trust their own intuition. In fact, every school system I've ever been a part of or I've ever witnessed has been stamping intuition down and never igniting it, because what it does is intuition allows you to be a free thinker. And authority systems try to push down your ability to be able to think for yourselves system-wise. I'm not saying that the people who are in it are doing that, but the system itself wants you to be a worker, not to be
Well,
a free thinker.
The goal of the system was to create replaceable cogs, and it's what the Prussians,
Yeah.
the Horace Mann, designed our public education system. It's what he did. There is schools that do what you say they don't. If you look at the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, which is which is the first of its kind, and there have been models after it. They don't have teachers; they only have staff. The only thing you learn is what you are interested in. You
That's
can
awesome.
start there as young as 4 years old. In order to graduate, you have to give a defense of an idea to the entire school, and they vote whether or not you graduate. It's a really phenomenal form of education. It's certainly not going to be successful for everybody, but if you are it's an opportunity that if you're a motivated, intelligent individual, you can thrive there, because the goal is to say, what are you interested in? What do you want to learn? What do you want to put your time into? How can we help you do that?
It's amazing.
They only have one
that would
rule.
be incredible.
One rule. You
What's
have
the
to
rule?
show up.
So
That's it.
So the other side of
the
that,
only
though-
way you can get kicked out of the school is if you don't show up. So you have to show up. You can't cut school.
And I think this is what prevents magical thinking, is that on the other side of that, we have to say, I love that idea. That's amazing. And it actually feels like a very direct reflection of everything that I was just saying. But then on the other side of it, we should also be saying, does it work?
The kids I know that went there have all been very successful. They're very uniquely and unusually successful. What I think it produces more than anything else are excellent communicators who are really thoughtful, and that is the key skill set for everything, right? Like,
So
you
then
know,
why couldn't it work in
It sure could.
in Lawrence or work in
It
Lowell?
absolutely
or
could.
work
I think
in-
it
certainly
definitely
could.
requires really motivated parents to be involved. It's hard to if your parent is not involved, because of that you must show up kind of rule, and there is not a lot of structure. I think one of the problems they have a lot is I'd love to have someone who has more authority in this area than me talk about this, but one of the times that my friends who came in later in life, like in late middle school or early high school, they're so poisoned by the way that traditional education works. Their first 4 years there is just like smoking weed in the woods, because they just have to get rid of it all. But then they figure it out, right? It takes a little while, so it's almost they have to detox or something. I don't know. I certainly think it'd be hard to replicate. As a mass education system, it's just you have to want to be interested, right? And I think I'm not a big fan of continued compulsory education, but I do think we have to have a minimal level of compulsory education,
Yeah.
right? Like I think that everyone needs to learn how to read and write and do some basic
Yeah.
math, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think everybody needs to learn calculus. I don't think everybody needs to learn algebra. I do argue that those are things that you think they are natural forms of thinking. We have just presented them in a kind of unnatural way,
But maybe there's really simple formulas to this that we just, as a collective, we've just never given ourselves permission. And maybe the first one is do we want workers
Yeah.
or do we want free thinkers? And personally, I can't speak for everybody, and everybody's children, but I want to raise free thinkers. I'm not interested in raising
What is
kids
the
to
tension
go.
in public school really is teachers. Every teacher I've ever met wants free thinking, intelligent, articulate kids in their classroom, but the system they are working within was never designed to
It's
produce
for the opposite.
such that
you
thing.
know this,
right?
You
It
know,
was-
you know everything about all of the authority that has caused all of this.
It strikes me that the conversation that we're having right now is so unbelievably important that we recognize the power in what we're saying is that 98% of the people don't want this. And yet this is what 98% of the children are experiencing when they go in, is that they're getting a uniformed experience that teaches them to become something that is not in their best interest.
Right.
And I was okay being ignorant to that for a long time, because ignorance can sometimes be a very comfortable state of being. But the more I was willing to be uncomfortable so that I could grow, the more I started to realize that these are questions that can no longer go unasked. These aren't things that we can be accepting of a system. One of the things that my mom taught me that I always found to be the best lesson that she ever gave me was that it's not a good move to support a system that doesn't support you. And that if you're a part of a system that does not feel like it sees you at all, don't go and amplify that system for it to not see more people. And I think we just got to all look at that. My experience is not going to be the same as everybody else's experience, but it doesn't look like the collective experience is also in the best interest of the collective either. And I would just I ended up giving a guy a ride home from yoga today. Didn't know this guy. I've been going to yoga with him for a while, but he just happened to need a ride home, so I gave him one. He's a middle school teacher, and I asked him, "What's it like being a middle school teacher right now?" And he said, "Not good." He was a middle school teacher in a community whose resources were limited, and he said that to be a middle school teacher right now, these kids, there are cameras everywhere. If they want to get up and go to the bathroom, they have to get permission to be able to do that. If they, to be a teacher in the classroom, there's almost no relationship that a teacher can have with their students anymore because it has become so transactional of just get this thing done and get out of my classroom and go here and there. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot like prison. And that is not the environment that I want a young person's mind in as they're starting to develop into wherever it goes. Like, I can't be alone in this. It can't be the first person to think like that is literally everything that you would describe in a low, like in a minimum grade prison. That's exactly how they would describe what inmates were also going through, is this very controlled environment. And yet I also understand that if I was a part of that system, I could be convinced very quickly that, like, what else are you going to do? It's chaos. If you give the inmates any room at all, they're going to run the asylum and then you're done. And what do we do about it? But I think it's a system problem.
Totally.
One of the really interesting conversations that I had so I was working until recently as a case manager in a group home for teens. So these are teens who either can't live at home with family for a variety of different reasons or don't have a family to take care of them. And some of these kids have been raised in the modern equivalent of orphanages from a very young age. And there is definitely that mindset of we teach kids to just obey authority because there's 50 kids in a room with one adult and we need the kids to hop to if the adult says, okay, stop drinking the bleach, right? And there's not enough room and there's not enough time for the adult to explain why. You just need the kids to hop to and listen. So I did a lot of work with these young people who were 16 to 22 and like unlearning this I need to obey authority mindset that they had been given. And one example was I had one young woman who came up to me one day and she was like, "Do you think I should drink 3 cans of Coke?" And she was expecting me to be like, "No, you can't do that. Put those back in the fridge." And then we would like get into a little tussle and she would get the attention that she wanted. And instead I was like, you can do whatever you want. It's your own body. But I want you to keep in mind that if you drink a ton of caffeine right now at 6 p.m., you might not sleep well. And eventually, not only was she able to start making decisions in her own benefit, she realized that pushing against an authority wasn't in her best interest. Her best interest was to figure out what she and her body needed and then communicate with people around her about how to get that. But it's really hard to like break that mentality of like, I do what I'm told. I do what I'm told. I don't have to analyze what my own body needs. I don't have to analyze my own decisions because I just do what I'm told. And if I don't like it, I do the opposite, which is also not helpful.
One of the things, though, Alex, that seems to be exceptional about you that has come out many times tonight is that you have been in positions of authority but choose not to use it. And that the people who are on the other end of you have tremendous reactions to somebody who they understand is in a position that could flex. And instead of flexing, you choose to use curiosity or you choose to use compassion or you choose to use something that is way more effective tool than do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I'm going to take one. What time is it?
Oh, I have no idea.
I was gonna. So
Is
I
it 10
did give
past
you
10?
guys
Yeah.
the,
I was looking
the
at your watch.
signal for
Okay,
question 3.
So I'll tell
We
you
are
what,
well
guys.
past
'Cause I
question
think-
3 time.
Yeah, we went well
I don't
over.
mind staying. I just need to make a text. I just don't want someone to think like
Yes.
that I dropped off the face of the
I can
earth.
totally.
If you don't mind.
Yeah,
Just real
I'm
quick.
still
You can
alive.
keep talking. I know.
Why don't we
'cause-
do this, guys? Because I think that this was. This conversation was really interesting that we just had, and it went in a lot of different dynamic directions. This last question is the question that I hope might end up being the most impactful for all of us to be able to think about, that maybe ties everything together. So, Lisa's.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
I'll hand this one over to you when you're ready for it. And we don't have to take a long time with this question, but hopefully this question will allow us to be able to wrap this up.
All right. Rip it right open, see? Actually, it is such a nice stamp. I love that. Oh, good. It's big letters, so I don't need my glasses. Okay. What does living your best life look like to you?
I think we've actually already said it a few times. That's authenticity. You know, it's like being your as true to yourself. I really don't want to use that word true, but as authentic to yourself as you can be. I think that's you know been the common theme. I think over and over again is authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Does that feel the same for everybody?
Totally, that is good. I think for me, at this point in my life, with everything I've lived and all the stuff and had a complete career change, and living my best life is being able to share the knowledge that I have now about the energy body to people who may have otherwise never heard about this. You know, like, and so I'm so grateful for that, and I'm happy with what I'm doing, even though I took a leap of faith. And not to get into any details, but regardless of all the things that I've been through and where I'm at now in my life, I wouldn't change a thing. Mm-hmm. And I love what I'm doing, and I'm just so grateful. And lifelong learning. I just said this to someone else. We never stop learning. And it's okay to start learning something completely different that you never thought you'd even be interested in, because sometimes what happens is the people around us think, why are you doing that? Or why do you need to do that? And when we listen to what other people think is best for us is where we limit ourselves.
Yeah. And it's rational to change your mind when you learn new things too.
Yeah. And so I'm so grateful. Yeah.
I don't know. Figuring it out.
Yeah, and that's okay.
I feel like I'm at a point in my life right now where I am spending a lot of time thinking about the balance between wanting to be part of a community and to spend my energy and my time working on making the community better, and also on making sure that I know how to check in with what I need and build the things that I need within myself. And it's really, really difficult in the world that we live in to do both things, right? It's really, really difficult to be both secure and safe and have the money that you need to survive, and also be really invested in doing work that betters whatever community you want to name, whatever line you want to draw around people, wherever you want to group it. So I think that that's a really tricky balance, and that's what I'm trying to figure out right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wish I could tell you that one gets tremendously easier, but I think that that's something that remains for the rest of our lives is all of that. I'll just say, from my point of view, the more that I've been through, it is authenticity for sure. But then there's like another layer to it to me that feels like it's peace. You know what I mean? To feel at peace. And to feel like you can be around other people and to know that the energy that you're carrying and the energy that they're carrying makes you feel like you want to find peace together. And I think that a lot of what's happening in the world right now feels like maybe the opposite of that, but that there is real opportunity. And tonight was an amazing example. And I'm so appreciative to all three of you for taking this risk, for coming onto a podcast that you knew a little bit about, but probably not a ton. And we went all in tonight, from the conversation we had before the podcast started to where we got to in the variety of conversations that we had. But I hope that all of us can leave feeling a level of peace, that that your contributions to this conversation were amazing and appreciated, and that hopefully anybody who chooses to listen to this podcast will be able to leave the podcast feeling a little bit more like they have an opportunity to find some peace. And just grateful to all three of you for your time and attention. And come back if you want to have more conversations. Look at all the themes that we're doing, and please come back as often as you want to. All we're going to do is Oliver and I are going to do our best, and the rest of our team, to figure out if we can do 3,000 of these things and figure out if we can create a deep catalog of human experience and continue to just try to have authentic and honest conversations as often as we can.
Well, thank you so
was a
much.
pleasure.
Yeah, I really
Enjoyed
enjoyed it. Yeah,
Chatting with
nice
people who I
meeting
wouldn't
you.
have encountered probably
know.
otherwise. So
Yeah,
it's
isn't it
really
like
cool.
it's kind of crazy? This
So
is
true.
actually, I will say, one thing that's really special about this episode is that this is the first episode where, at least as the host, that I didn't have a previous relationship with at least one person who was in the room.
Nice.
So this was a really cool experience to all sit down, and we didn't. I mean, we knew each other because we knew Oliver, so there was a little bit of that here tonight. But for the most part, we didn't know each other before we stepped into this room. And I've got to be honest, I would trust all three of you in a heartbeat if, based on the experience that we had in this room. And I think that that says a lot. You know, it was maybe 5 hours that we've spent together, and we
so
said
crazy.
3.
I know.
But I think that it still remains true that when we open ourselves up, vulnerability is an opportunity. It's not it's not something to be afraid of. It's something to lean into, because the more you lean into it, we get good at anything we practice. And I think we think that not being vulnerable keeps us safe. And my experience is that it's actually the exact opposite, that the less vulnerable you are, the more susceptible you are to something that's going to happen that you would prefer not to.
Yeah,
So
it's true.
thank you. And that is a wrap for season 1, episode 2. So thanks, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.